Picture a wooden meeting house on a cold morning somewhere in New England, sometime in the 1700s. Frost clings to the small windows. The benches are hard and unforgiving. And yet, when the voices rise together, dozens of them, untrained but full-hearted, singing a hymn in the kind of harmony that only comes from people who have sung together their whole lives. Something genuinely powerful fills that room. No instruments. Just human voices, rising and falling together, carrying words that had crossed an ocean to get there. That sound, raw, communal, deeply felt, is one of the very first threads in a story that's going to take us across 250 years, through plantation fields and recording studios, through smoky jazz clubs and church basements, through garage bands and Bronx block parties, all the way to the global, genre-blending, endlessly streaming music landscape of today. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And while you're getting settled, I'd love it if you dropped a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There's something wonderful about imagining this story. A story about American music, traveling out to so many different corners of the globe, into so many different homes, at so many different hours of the night. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. 250 years of American music is, in many ways, the story of America itself. Its migrations, its conflicts, its joys, its injustices, and its endless capacity for reinvention. And like so many things about this country, the story doesn't begin with a single, clean starting point. It begins with multiple starting points, arriving from different directions, often at the same time, carried by people who had no idea their traditions would eventually collide and combine into something the world had never heard before. Let's start with what was already here. Long before European ships arrived on these shores, Native American communities across the continent had their own deep, sophisticated musical traditions. Music that was, for the most part, spiritual in nature, performed in groups as part of ceremonies, songs that connected communities to the land, to their ancestors, to the cycles of the seasons. This music used instruments like drums, rattles, and flutes, and it served purposes that went far beyond entertainment. It was woven into the fabric of religious and community life in ways that European visitors, accustomed to thinking of music primarily as performance or entertainment, often struggled to understand or appreciate. For a very long time, this Native American musical tradition existed largely outside the awareness of the broader American musical mainstream. It wasn't until the late 1800s, as we'll discuss later tonight, that wider American culture began to take any real notice of these traditions. And even then, that recognition came filtered through the lens of composers looking for exotic material rather than genuine cultural exchange. But I want to plant this flag right at the start of our journey tonight, because Native American musical traditions are part of this story. They were here first, they continued throughout everything we're about to discuss, and they deserve to be acknowledged as a genuine thread in the tapestry, even if, for much of this story, that thread runs along the edges rather than through the center. Now let's talk about what the European settlers brought with them, because this is where our story really starts to gather momentum. When colonists arrived from England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, Italy, and France, they brought their music with them. And I mean this literally. They brought ballads, dance tunes, hymns, comic opera songs, drum signals, even sonatas, played on whatever instruments happened to survive the journey across the Atlantic. This wasn't American music in any meaningful sense yet. It was essentially European music that happened to now be played in America by people trying to recreate the cultural world they'd left behind. In New England specifically, music took on a deeply religious character. The Puritan communities that settled there had complicated feelings about music. Some of the stricter religious traditions viewed elaborate, ornamented music with suspicion, associating it with worldly vanity. But communal singing, particularly the singing of psalms and hymns, was central to religious life. And out of this religious singing tradition emerged something genuinely American. A group of composers sometimes called the Yankee Tunesmiths, who began writing their own hymns and sacred music, often using a notation system called shape notes, where the printed music used different shapes: triangles, circles, squares, diamonds, to represent different pitches, making it easier for untrained singers to learn to read music and sing in harmony. This shape note singing tradition is something I find genuinely fascinating because it represents one of the earliest examples of something we're going to see again and again throughout tonight's journey. Ordinary, often untrained people finding ways to create and participate in music, developing their own systems and traditions when the formal European systems didn't quite fit their circumstances. Shape note singing survives today, remarkably, in certain communities. There are still shape note singing conventions held in parts of the American South, where people gather, often for an entire day, to sing through hundreds of these old hymns together, exactly as their ancestors did centuries ago. If you've ever heard a recording of one of these gatherings, dozens of voices, arranged in a square formation, singing with an intensity and a rawness that's almost startling, you're hearing a sound that connects directly back to those cold New England meeting houses. In 1776, the same year the United States declared its independence, something happened in Charleston, in the province of South Carolina, that tells us something important about how music was developing in a completely different direction in other parts of the colonies. The St. Cecilia Music Society opened its doors. This was a formal concert society, the kind of institution that wealthy colonists in port cities like Charleston used to bring European-style classical music, orchestral concerts, formal performances, to American audiences. Societies like this began appearing in cities throughout the northern colonies as well, representing a completely different musical world from the shape note singers of New England or the folk traditions developing elsewhere. A world of formal concerts, imported European repertoire, and the cultural aspirations of colonial elites who wanted their cities to feel connected to the musical life of London, Vienna, and Paris. So already, within the very first years of American independence, we have at least 3 genuinely distinct musical worlds existing simultaneously. Native American, ceremonial traditions continuing as they had for centuries. The religious, communal singing traditions of places like New England, developing their own American innovations like shape notes. And the formal European concert tradition, being deliberately imported and cultivated in cities like Charleston. And we haven't even gotten to the thread that, I'd argue, ends up being the single most influential of all. As settlers moved southward and westward, many of them, often poor Europeans from England, Scotland, and Ireland, settled in the Appalachian Mountains, a vast mountain range running through what's now states like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. These settlers brought with them a tradition of ballads, story songs, often about love, tragedy, betrayal, and a tradition of fiddle playing. Songs like Barbara Allen and Mattie Groves, old British ballads, made the journey across the ocean and then up into these mountain hollows where they began to change. Here's something genuinely interesting about this process of change. These British ballads, originally often about love and tragedy in a British context, started shifting their subject matter to reflect American experiences, mining accidents, train wrecks, disasters specific to American life. The basic musical structure, the melody, the storytelling format, stayed recognizably British in its bones, but the content became American. This is, I think, one of the clearest early examples of something that's going to happen over and over throughout tonight's story. An imported tradition taking root in American soil and slowly, gradually, becoming something new, while still carrying visible traces of where it came from. And about that fiddle playing, there's a genuinely interesting debate among musicologists about exactly where Appalachian fiddle styles came from. Some people have argued that a specific rhythmic technique called the Scotch snap, a quick, snapping rhythm associated with Scottish music, was a major influence on how Appalachian fiddlers played. But historians still argue about how much weight to give this specific Scottish influence versus a more blended picture. Many scholars now describe English, Scottish, Irish, and American fiddle traditions as having developed together almost like cultural cousins, each influencing the others in ways that are genuinely difficult to untangle into neat, separate strands. I think this is a great example of something we're going to encounter again and again tonight. The temptation to trace a musical tradition back to one single, clean point of origin, when the reality is almost always more tangled, more collaborative, and more interesting than that. Now here's where our story takes its most significant turn, a turn that, more than any other single thread, shapes everything that comes after. Beginning with the earliest days of European colonization and continuing for centuries, enslaved Africans were brought to American shores against their will, and they brought with them, in the deepest, most literal sense, because it was something that couldn't be physically taken away from them, even as everything else was, their music. African musical traditions brought entirely new instruments into the American musical world. The banjo, for instance, an instrument that most people today associate strongly with American folk and country music, actually has roots that trace back through Africa and ultimately connect to even older instrument traditions from the Arabian world. Drums, too, came from African traditions. Though, as we'll discuss, the use of drums by enslaved people was often restricted or banned outright by slaveholders who feared drums could be used to communicate and coordinate resistance. Which tells you something about how seriously the power of this music was understood, even by the people trying to suppress it. African musical traditions also brought rhythmic complexity, call-and-response singing patterns, and ways of telling stories through song that were fundamentally different from the European ballad tradition. And these traditions didn't stay separate from the European traditions we've been discussing. They began, almost immediately, to blend, to influence, to combine, often in conditions of genuine horror and oppression, but producing something that neither tradition, on its own, could have produced. I want to pause here and acknowledge something important, because I think it's genuinely necessary for understanding everything that follows tonight. The musical traditions that enslaved African and African American people created and preserved, under conditions of slavery, and then under the conditions of segregation and discrimination that followed, form the foundation of an enormous portion of what we now think of as American music. Spirituals, work songs, the blues, jazz, gospel, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, soul, funk, hip-hop. These genres, which between them represent perhaps the most globally influential body of music ever created by any culture in human history, trace directly back to African American communities, developing under circumstances of oppression that most of us, thankfully, will never have to experience. This isn't a side note to American music history. In a very real sense, it's the main story. Though it's a part of the story that, for much of American history, wasn't told honestly, wasn't credited properly, and was often actively obscured, with the contributions of black musicians minimized, erased, or appropriated by white performers and the industry structures that surrounded them. Tonight, as we move through the decades and the genres, I want to make sure we're telling this story honestly, giving credit where credit is due, acknowledging the complexity and sometimes the genuine pain behind some of the most beloved music ever created, while also celebrating the extraordinary creativity, resilience, and genius that produced it. So as we move forward from this colonial starting point, Native American ceremonial traditions, New England hymn singing and shape notes, formal European concert societies in port cities, Appalachian ballads and fiddle tunes carried over from the British Isles, and African musical traditions that enslaved people carried with them and preserved against extraordinary odds. Keep all of these threads in mind, because over the next 250 years, these threads are going to cross paths again and again, sometimes blending peacefully, sometimes through genuinely ugly historical circumstances, but always producing something new. And the first place we're going to watch this happen in a truly transformative way is in the fields and small communities of the post-Civil War South, where one of these threads is about to give birth to a sound that will eventually reshape music everywhere on Earth. Let's travel now to the late 1800s, to the flat, fertile farmland of the Mississippi Delta. That wide stretch of land between the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers in the northwestern part of Mississippi, land so rich and dark it almost looks black when it's freshly turned. The air here is heavy and humid, thick with the smell of earth and cotton plants, and the work is brutal. Bent backs in endless rows under a sun that doesn't seem to care how tired you are. The Civil War had ended. Slavery had technically been abolished. But for the African Americans living in this region, freedom in any meaningful economic sense remained largely out of reach. Many former slaves stayed on the same land, working now as sharecroppers. Technically free, but trapped in a system of debt and dependency that, in practice, often looked uncomfortably similar to the system that had preceded it. Life was hard, options were limited, and out of this specific combination of freedom and continued oppression, something extraordinary began to take shape. The blues. The blues emerged from a blending of several older traditions. The field hollers that workers had used to communicate across distances and to keep rhythm during repetitive labor, African American spirituals with their deep emotional and religious resonance, work songs that helped pace physical labor, and the storytelling traditions that had survived from earlier generations. What emerged from this blend was something genuinely new, a musical form built around a simple, flexible structure. Often what's called a 12-bar pattern, using just a few basic chords, but capable of expressing an extraordinary range of human emotion, from devastating sorrow to wry, dark humor to genuine joy. The lyrics of early blues songs covered the full range of human experience: love and its loss, poverty, hard labor, jail, drinking, and yes, sometimes death. Though I want to be clear that this isn't gore for its own sake. It's the honest subject matter of people's actual lives, sung about with a directness that I think is part of why this music has endured for so long. There's something genuinely powerful about music that doesn't shy away from difficult subjects, that says, this is what my life is actually like, rather than retreating into more comfortable or sanitized territory. One of the most important things to understand about the blues in this earliest period is that it existed almost entirely outside of what we'd think of as the music industry. There were no record companies interested in recording this music yet. It was performed in homes, in small gathering places that came to be called juke joints, by musicians who often worked other jobs and played music as something between a side income and a calling. This means that for decades, the blues developed and evolved largely undocumented, passed from person to person, changing and adapting in ways that we can only partially reconstruct today through the memories and later recordings of the musicians who lived through this period. Historians still argue about exactly when and where the blues began. Whether it's accurate to point to the Mississippi Delta specifically as the birthplace, given that similar musical developments were likely happening simultaneously in other parts of the rural South, including Texas and the Piedmont region along the East Coast. Some scholars have pushed back specifically on the idea that the Delta deserves singular credit, pointing out that musicians and musical styles were developing in parallel across multiple regions, and that the Delta's later fame as the birthplace of the blues may partly reflect which musicians happened to get recorded, rather than necessarily reflecting where the music genuinely originated first. I think this is a genuinely important point, and it's one we're going to see repeated throughout tonight's journey. The places that get remembered as where it all started aren't always the same as the places where things actually started. Sometimes they're just the places where someone happened to be holding a recording device at the right moment. What we can say with more confidence is that the Mississippi Delta specifically developed a particular style of blues, now often called Delta blues, characterized by expressive, often raw vocal performances, and by the prominent use of guitar, including a technique called slide guitar, where the musician runs a smooth object, sometimes literally a glass bottleneck, sometimes a piece of metal, along the strings to create a sliding, vocal-like sound. This style produced some of the most influential musicians in American history, names like Charlie Patton, Son House, and Robert Johnson. Though I want to flag here that some of the most famous stories about figures like Robert Johnson, including legends about him supposedly making a deal with the devil at a crossroads in exchange for his musical talent, fall very much into the category of folklore, rather than verified history. It's a wonderfully evocative story, and it tells you something about how mysterious and powerful this music seemed to the people encountering it. But I want to be clear that this is legend, not documented fact. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that I think genuinely surprises people. Delta blues wasn't actually recorded commercially until quite late. The late 1920s, even though the music had clearly existed in some form for decades before that. One researcher who studied this period closely noted that when he heard early blues-tinged music being performed at a Mississippi plantation around 1901 or 1902, it was being sung by a performer who was already quite old at the time, meaning this performer had been born before slavery ended and had presumably been singing music influenced by these traditions for most of their life, decades before anyone thought to record it. There's also a genuinely interesting geographic detail here that connects to something we'll come back to later. Part of the reason the blues flourished so strongly and so distinctly in places like Mississippi is connected to isolation. During the key years when Delta blues was developing, Mississippi had some of the lowest rates in the entire country for things like radio ownership, automobile ownership, and telephone access. The very communities where this music was developing most intensely were also among the most cut off from the rest of the country, which meant the music could develop its own distinct character, relatively undiluted by outside influences, for longer than it might have in more connected areas. Now let's travel just a bit south and east, down the Mississippi River, to a city that was developing its own, genuinely different musical revolution at roughly the same time: New Orleans. New Orleans had a history unlike almost anywhere else in America, a deeply mixed cultural heritage involving French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean influences, layered on top of each other in ways that created a city with a genuinely unique cultural character. And one specific location in this city deserves particular attention: a public square that came to be known as Congo Square. In the 1700s and into the 1800s, enslaved and free black people in New Orleans were permitted, under certain restrictions, and only because Louisiana had been under French and Spanish colonial rule, with somewhat different customs around enslaved people's gatherings than English colonies had, to gather in this square, particularly on Sundays, to play music, sing, dance, and trade goods. This gathering preserved African musical traditions, rhythms, instruments, performance styles, in a way that was, frankly, almost unique in North America, because in most other parts of the country, gatherings like this were forbidden, specifically because of the fear we mentioned earlier about drums and music being used for communication and resistance. Congo Square, in other words, became a place where African musical DNA survived more intact, more visibly, for longer than almost anywhere else in the country. And this preserved musical heritage became one of the essential ingredients in what would eventually emerge from New Orleans: jazz. By the early 1900s, New Orleans was a city absolutely saturated with music. Brass bands played for funerals. And I mean this in a genuinely fascinating way, because a New Orleans jazz funeral tradition developed where the band would play somber, dirge-like music on the way to the cemetery, and then, on the way back, would switch to upbeat, celebratory music, a tradition that survives to this day and that captures something genuinely beautiful about how this culture related to grief and joy as connected rather than opposed experiences. Musicians performed in dance halls, in bars, and this is a detail that I think genuinely surprises people. In the city's red light district, an area called Storyville, which existed as a legally designated entertainment district from around 1897 until it was shut down in 1917. I want to be careful here, because there's sometimes a tendency to overstate Storyville's importance to jazz's actual development. Jazz didn't originate specifically in Storyville, and plenty of important early jazz happened in other parts of the city entirely, particularly in black neighborhoods uptown. But Storyville was a place where many visitors to New Orleans first encountered this new music, which meant it played a real role in how jazz's reputation, for better and for worse, spread beyond the city itself. The instrumentation that became standard for early New Orleans jazz developed directly from these brass band and dance band traditions. Cornet, clarinet, trombone, tuba, banjo, and drums became the core group, and the music itself had a distinctive quality. It was largely improvised, with multiple instruments often playing different melodic lines simultaneously in a kind of joyful, organized chaos, all built on top of a blues-influenced harmonic foundation and a loose, ragged rhythmic feel that connected back to an earlier popular style called ragtime. And it's here, in this environment. Funeral bands, dance halls, the streets of a city where music was simply everywhere, all the time, that one of the most important figures in all of American music was born. Louis Armstrong was born in New Orleans in 1901 into genuinely difficult circumstances: poverty, racial segregation under Jim Crow laws, and what his biographers describe as an environment of real danger and instability. But he was also born into this incredibly rich musical world. He grew up hearing the ecstatic music of black churches, the blues played by street musicians, and the practice of ragging, a tune, taking an existing melody and reworking its rhythm in syncopated, playful ways. Armstrong would go on to become, by most accounts, the single most influential figure in the history of jazz. Not just as a trumpet player of extraordinary skill, but as someone who helped shift the entire focus of the music. Early jazz, as we've described it, was largely a collective, ensemble-based music, multiple instruments weaving together. Armstrong's playing, and his approach more broadly, helped push jazz towards something that featured individual improvised solos, moments where a single musician would step forward and create something spontaneous in real time while the rest of the band supported them. This shift, from collective improvisation to featured individual soloing, is one of the most significant developments in jazz history, and it set a template that jazz, and countless other genres that followed, would build on for the rest of the century. Armstrong also pioneered something called scat singing, using nonsense syllables to improvise vocally, the same way an instrumentalist would improvise on their instrument, treating the human voice as just another instrument in the band. And here's a genuinely fun, light moment I want to share. There's a story, repeated often though, I'll flag that some details of it have become a bit legendary over the years, that Armstrong first started scat singing during a recording session when he dropped his sheet music and, rather than stop the take, simply started singing nonsense syllables to fill the space. Whether that's precisely how it happened, or whether it's a slightly polished version of a more gradual development, the broader point stands. Scat singing became one of Armstrong's signatures, and it added an entirely new vocabulary to how the human voice could be used in popular music. By 1949, Armstrong had become the first jazz musician to ever appear on the cover of Time magazine, a genuinely significant marker of how far this music, which had started in dance halls and funeral processions in a segregated southern city, had traveled in just a few decades. And we're only in roughly 1920 to 1950 in our timeline tonight. There's so much more ahead. Let's connect this back to something we discussed earlier, because I think it's worth pausing on. Remember those spirituals we talked about, born out of secret religious gatherings where enslaved people combined African musical traditions with Christian worship? Those spirituals didn't just influence the blues, they also became deeply intertwined with jazz, particularly through gospel music, which developed as its own genuinely distinct genre, but which shared deep roots with both the blues and jazz. Gospel singers like Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Mahalia Jackson became enormously influential. And Sister Rosetta Tharpe, in particular, deserves a moment of real attention here, because her electric guitar playing, her showmanship, and her blending of gospel material with what was essentially a rock and roll performance style decades before rock and roll existed as a term, has led many music historians to describe her as a genuine foundational figure for rock and roll itself. Someone whose influence on guitar playing and performance style runs in a direct line to musicians who would become famous decades later, even though her own name doesn't always get the same recognition. So by the time we're approaching the middle of the 20th century, we've got blues developing in the rural South, jazz developing in New Orleans, and then spreading to cities across the country as musicians migrated north and west, gospel developing alongside both of these as a genuinely powerful musical and cultural force in its own right, in all three of these: blues, jazz, and gospel, sharing deep roots in the spirituals and work songs that enslaved African Americans had created and preserved generations earlier. These threads are about to combine again in a small studio in Memphis, Tennessee, in a way that's going to change everything. Let's shift our attention now to a completely different region and a completely different cultural tradition. One that's going to turn out to be just as essential to the story of American music as everything we've covered so far, even though, on the surface, it might seem to have almost nothing in common with the blues and jazz traditions we've just spent time with. We talked, back in our first section, about settlers moving into the Appalachian Mountains, bringing with them ballads and fiddle tunes from England, Scotland, and Ireland, and about how these traditions began changing, shifting their subject matter to reflect American experiences, blending with other influences they encountered along the way. For well over a century, this music remained largely a regional, rural tradition, played at home, at community gatherings, passed down within families and small communities, with no commercial industry built around it at all. That changed dramatically and suddenly in the summer of 1927 in a small city on the border between Tennessee and Virginia called Bristol. A talent scout and record producer named Ralph Peer, working for the Victor Talking Machine Company, had an idea. Record companies at this point had started to realize there might be commercial potential in recording the kind of rural music, what was sometimes dismissively called hillbilly music at the time, that was being performed throughout the Appalachian region. So Peer placed advertisements in local newspapers, inviting musicians from the surrounding area to come to a makeshift recording studio that had been set up in a converted hat warehouse in Bristol and record their songs. Over about 2 weeks, 19 different acts showed up. Most of them have been largely forgotten by history. But 2 of these acts would go on to become, in a very real sense, the founding figures of an entirely new commercial genre: country music. The first act was a family group, a husband and wife, plus the wife's cousin, who also happened to be married to the husband's brother, making this a genuinely tangled family tree even before you get into the music. This was the Carter family: A.P. Carter, his wife Sarah, and Sarah's cousin Maybelle. All 3 had grown up in Southwest Virginia, immersed in mountain gospel music and the same shape note singing traditions we discussed back in our very first section tonight. There's a genuine thread connecting those cold New England meeting houses all the way to this recording session in 1927. AP sang the low harmony parts. Sarah sang lead and played either auto harp or guitar, and Maybelle, who would go on to become one of the most influential guitarists in American music history through a picking style that came to be known as the Carter Scratch, provided harmony vocals and instrumental backing. At the Bristol sessions, the Carter family recorded 5 songs, including ones called Bury Me Under the Weeping Willow and Little Log Cabin by the Sea, songs that became genuine hits and that established the Carter family as one of the most popular acts in this new genre for the next 15 years. The second act was a thin, frail-looking man who walked into the Bristol studio essentially alone, carrying just his guitar. His name was Jimmy Rogers, and he'd traveled about 100 miles to get there after the string band he'd previously toured with had broken up following some kind of dispute. Rogers recorded 2 songs at Bristol, including one called Sleep Baby, Sleep, and it was on this recording that Rogers introduced a vocal technique that would become his signature and one of the most influential vocal styles in all of country music, yodeling. This distinctive, rapid shift between his normal singing voice and a higher falsetto register became known as his blue yodel, and it was copied by countless country artists in the decades that followed. Jimmy Rogers would go on to be enormously successful over the following 6 years, until his death in 1933. And he's often referred to as the father of country music, becoming the first person ever inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. The legendary musician Johnny Cash later called what happened during those 2 weeks in Bristol the single most important event in the history of country music, and the small Tennessee-Virginia border city has, ever since, billed itself as the birthplace of country music, with a museum dedicated to preserving and celebrating this history. I do want to add a small note of nuance here, because I think it's genuinely important, and it's a pattern we've seen before tonight. Commercial recordings of what we now call country music had actually begun a few years earlier than 1927. The first such recordings date back to around 1922. So Bristol wasn't, technically, the absolute first moment this kind of music was recorded. But the Bristol sessions are remembered as the breakthrough moment. The point where this music found its first true commercial superstars, the moment that, in retrospect, looks like the birth of country music as a recognizable, marketable genre, even if the actual roots and even the actual first recordings extend a bit further back than that single famous summer. I find this genuinely fascinating because of how closely it mirrors something we'll see again later tonight with rock and roll. There's almost always a real origin point that's a bit messier and earlier than the famous origin point that gets remembered. The famous moment isn't necessarily wrong, but it's often more like the moment a longer process became visible to a wider audience, rather than the actual beginning of the process itself. Let's think for a moment about what made country music, as it developed from these roots, distinctly different from the blues and jazz traditions we discussed earlier, and also, importantly, about where these traditions overlapped, because the overlap is genuinely significant. Country music, in its early form, drew heavily on storytelling. Songs about family, about hardship, about faith, about home, often with a strong narrative structure where the lyrics tell a clear story from beginning to end. The instrumentation centered on string instruments, guitar, banjo, fiddle, and later instruments like the steel guitar and mandolin, reflecting its roots in those Appalachian folk traditions. But here's where things get genuinely interesting, and where I want to push back gently on any version of this story that treats country music and the blues as 2 completely separate, racially divided traditions that never touched each other. The reality is considerably more blended than that. Jimmy Rogers himself, the so-called father of country music, recorded songs that incorporated blues, structures, and blues feeling, sometimes literally titled blues songs. The banjo, which became such a central instrument in country and bluegrass music, as we discussed in our first section, has roots that trace back through African and ultimately Arabian instrument traditions. It's not a European instrument that country music simply adopted. It's an instrument whose presence in American music exists specifically because of African and African American musical heritage. Historians still argue about exactly how to characterize the relationship between early country music and the blues and African American musical traditions more broadly. Some emphasize genuine, ongoing musical exchange between black and white musicians in the rural South, who often lived in close proximity, heard each other's music, and influenced each other in ways that the racial segregation of the broader society didn't fully prevent at the level of actual musical practice. Others emphasize that, regardless of the underlying musical exchange, the commercial recording industry of this era deliberately separated music along racial lines for marketing purposes, creating separate race records marketed to black audiences and hillbilly records marketed to white audiences, even when the actual musical content of these recordings had far more in common than the marketing, categories suggested. This marketing separation is genuinely important to understand because it created a kind of artificial divide in how this music has been remembered and categorized ever since. A divide that doesn't necessarily reflect how interconnected the actual musical traditions were on the ground, in the actual communities where this music was being made and shared. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that I think is a genuinely delightful piece of trivia, Maybelle Carter, that guitarist from the Carter family whose Carter scratch picking style became so influential, was 8 months pregnant during the Bristol sessions in 1927. She was about to give birth to a daughter, and that daughter, June Carter, would grow up to become a country music star in her own right, and would eventually marry a man whose career we're going to discuss in detail a bit later tonight. Johnny Cash, the same person who called the Bristol Sessions the most important event in country music history. So there's this wonderful, almost circular connection. The woman who was there at country music's founding moment, 8 months pregnant, gave birth to the daughter who would, decades later, marry the man who would help define what country music meant to an entirely new generation, and who would also be the one to look back and recognize the historical significance of the moment his future mother-in-law had helped create. I think it's also worth mentioning, before we move forward, that country music's development over the following decades was deeply tied to the city of Nashville, Tennessee, which became the genre's commercial and cultural capital. Though, interestingly, Nashville wasn't where the Bristol Sessions happened. There's actually a piece of regional history here where Bristol, despite its claim as the birthplace, ended up somewhat overshadowed by Nashville's rise as the industry center. A radio program based in Nashville called the Grand Ole Opry, which began broadcasting in the 1920s, became enormously influential in establishing Nashville as the place where country music careers were made, and that radio program is still broadcasting today, making it one of the longest-running radio programs in American history. So as we move forward in our timeline, I want you to hold on to this image. By the late 1920s, we've got the blues developing in the Mississippi Delta and beyond, jazz exploding out of New Orleans and spreading to cities across the country, gospel music developing as a powerful tradition in black churches, and now country music finding its first commercial superstars in a small Tennessee-Virginia border town. All of these traditions developing somewhat in parallel, sometimes overlapping, sometimes kept artificially separate by the marketing categories of the recording industry, but all of them drawing, in various ways, on that deep well of traditions we discussed at the very beginning of tonight's journey. British Isles, ballads, and fiddle tunes, African rhythms and instruments, religious singing traditions, both black and white, and the lived experiences of people, often very poor people, often facing genuine hardship, trying to make sense of their lives through song. And here's a cheeky thought for you, the kind of, you probably won't survive this reality check I promised earlier tonight. If you somehow found yourself transported back to that converted hat warehouse in Bristol in the summer of 1927, sitting in on those recording sessions, you'd be witnessing what's now considered one of the most significant moments in American music history, and you'd probably have absolutely no idea. To everyone in that room at the time, this was just another recording session, one of countless similar sessions happening across the country as record companies scrambled to find new hillbilly talent. Nobody was thinking, this is the birth of country music. They were thinking about getting paid, about whether their songs would sell, about getting back home. It's only with the benefit of nearly a century of hindsight that we can look back and say, this was the moment. And I think that's worth remembering as we continue tonight. At every single point in this story, the people living through these moments had no idea they were making history. They were just trying to make music and make a living the best way they knew how. We've spent our time so far moving through the late 1800s and the 1920s, watching the blues take shape in the Mississippi Delta, jazz explode out of New Orleans, gospel develop its own powerful tradition, and country music find its first commercial superstars in Bristol, Tennessee. Now let's push forward into the middle of the 20th century, into the 1930s, 1940s, and toward that explosive moment in the 1950s that most people, if you ask them, would point to as the single biggest turning point in all of American music history. But before we get there, I want to spend a little time in the 1930s and 1940s, because this period, sometimes overshadowed by what comes immediately after, was genuinely essential in setting the stage. The blues, which had developed largely in rural areas in the late 1800s and early 1900s, began undergoing a significant transformation during this period, driven by one of the largest internal migrations in American history. Beginning around the 1910s and continuing for decades, millions of African Americans moved from the rural South to cities in the North, Midwest, and West, a movement historians call the Great Migration. People were leaving behind the rural South for many reasons. Seeking better economic opportunities, escaping the often brutal realities of life under segregation, and, relevant to our story tonight, sometimes specifically seeking opportunities to become professional musicians, to record their music in cities where the recording industry was based, One of the musicians who made this journey, and whose story illustrates this transformation perfectly, was a man named McKinley Morganfield, known to the world as Muddy Waters. Waters grew up on a plantation in Mississippi called Stovall, where he learned a traditional style of Delta blues. When he moved to Chicago as part of this larger migration, he brought that traditional Delta sound with him. But in Chicago, surrounded by a new urban environment, new audiences, and crucially, new technology, that sound began to change. The key change was electrification. In Chicago, Muddy Waters and other musicians began playing electric guitars, adding drums and sometimes horns, transforming what had been intimate, often solo or small group acoustic blues into something louder, more rhythmically driving, designed to be heard in noisy city clubs rather than on a porch or in a small juke joint. This style became known as Chicago blues, and Muddy Waters became its most celebrated figure, sometimes called the king of the Chicago blues scene. Here's a quirky tidbit that I absolutely love, because it shows how these threads of influence ripple outward in ways that are genuinely surprising. Muddy Waters recorded a song called Rollin' Stone, which reportedly sold around 80,000 copies. That song's title went on to inspire the name of a British rock band that would become one of the most famous in the world, the Rolling Stones. It also influenced the title of a song by Bob Dylan, Like a Rolling Stone, which is often cited as one of the greatest songs ever recorded. And it eventually contributed to the name of a magazine, Rolling Stone, that became one of the most influential music publications in the world. So a single blues song, recorded by a Mississippi-born musician in Chicago, ended up echoing through a British rock band's name, a landmark Bob Dylan song, and the name of a major music magazine. That's the kind of ripple effect we're going to see again and again tonight. Small moments that end up echoing outward for decades in ways that nobody involved could have possibly predicted. Another musician who made a similar journey from Mississippi to Chicago was a man born Chester Arthur Burnett, who performed under the name Howlin' Wolf. Wolf had actually learned to play guitar from Charlie Patton, one of the foundational Delta blues figures we mentioned earlier, which gives you a genuine sense of how directly connected these generations of musicians were, even as the music itself transformed dramatically through electrification and urbanization. Wolf became, alongside Muddy Waters, one of the defining figures of Chicago blues, and both of these musicians would go on to have an enormous influence on the next major development in our story. Now, let's talk about something else that was happening during this period, something that connects back to a detail we mentioned briefly earlier: jump blues. This was a style, danceable, energetic, blending elements of the bigger swing band sound that was popular in the 1930s and 1940s with blues structures. And it was pioneered by musicians like Louis Jordan. Jump blues is often described as a direct precursor to what would eventually be called rhythm and blues, and through rhythm and blues to rock and roll itself. There's a specific, genuinely fascinating piece of musical lineage here that I want to walk through carefully, because it's the kind of thing that, once you know it, you start hearing connections everywhere. Louis Jordan had a guitarist named Carl Hogan, and Hogan played a guitar intro on one of Jordan's recordings that was, and this is documented, not speculation, copied note for note 12 years later by a young guitarist named Chuck Berry for what would become one of the most famous guitar intros in rock and roll history on a song called Johnny B. Good. Carl Hogan was, by Berry's own account, one of his early musical idols. So when you listen to Johnny B. Good, a song that's been described as essentially the defining sound of rock and roll guitar, you're hearing, in its opening notes, a direct echo of a jump blues guitarist from over a decade earlier. The new sound wasn't entirely new. It was, in part, a continuation, a tribute, a borrowing. Though I want to be careful with that word borrowing, because in the history of American music, the line between borrowing, tribute, influence, and outright uncredited appropriation is often genuinely blurry, and we're going to need to think carefully about that line as we move forward tonight, because it becomes increasingly important and increasingly fraught in the decades ahead. Let's also talk about another song from this period that deserves real attention, a song called Good Rockin' Tonight, recorded by a singer named Wynanie Harris in December 1947, which became a #1 hit on what was then called the Rhythm and Blues chart by the middle of 1948. This song is significant for a couple of reasons. First, it's part of a wave of songs from this era that used words like rocking or rock in their titles, words that would eventually give an entire genre its name. And second, there's a genuinely interesting piece of performance history connected to this song. It's been said that a young performer who would later become enormously famous was, in his early performances, essentially copying specific physical mannerisms. the hip movements, the lip curl, that he'd observed from Wynanie Harris. That young performer was Elvis Presley. I want to be genuinely careful and precise here, because Elvis Presley's place in this story is one of the most discussed, debated, and sometimes contentious topics in all of American music history, and I think it deserves to be handled with real care. So let's set the scene properly, because the actual sequence of events matters enormously for understanding what happened and why it mattered. In January of 1950, a man named Sam Phillips opened a recording studio in Memphis, Tennessee, called Sun Studio, which would soon also become home to a record label called Sun Records. Phillips had a specific musical philosophy. He was genuinely fascinated by the blues and rhythm and blues music being made by black musicians, music that, at this point in American history, was largely confined to what the industry called race records, marketed almost exclusively to black audiences, and rarely played on radio stations that catered to white listeners. Phillips believed this music, raw, emotionally direct, rhythmically powerful, deserved a much wider audience than it was getting. In fact, one of the very first recordings made at what would become Sun Studio in March of 1951 was a song called Rocket 88, credited to Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, though the actual band was led by a musician named Ike Turner, with Brenston, the saxophonist, taking lead vocals. This recording is often cited by music historians as one of the very first rock and roll records ever made, 3 years before Elvis Presley would walk into that same studio. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it connects directly to something we discussed in our previous section about Bristol and country music. The famous origin point and the actual origin point are often different, and the gap between them tells us something important. Rocket 88, made by black musicians in 1951 in the same Memphis studio, represents, for many historians, the genuine birth of rock and roll. But it's Elvis Presley's recordings, made in that same studio 3 years later, that became the moment most widely remembered, most widely celebrated, and most directly connected to rock and roll's explosion into mainstream popular culture. So what actually happened with Elvis? In July of 1954, Elvis Presley, at this point an unknown young man working as a truck driver, made his first commercial recording for Sun Records, a song called That's All Right. This song was actually a cover of a blues recording originally made by a musician named Arthur Big Boy Crudup back in 1946. Sam Phillips had reportedly been searching for, in his own words, someone who could capture a particular sound and feel. And when he heard Presley's version of this blues song, sung with what biographers describe as a high tenor voice carrying genuinely bluesy inflections, Phillips believed he'd found exactly what he was looking for. Here's where I want to be genuinely careful and clear, because this is exactly the kind of historical nuance that I think deserves real attention, rather than either of the two overly simple versions of this story that you often hear. One overly simple version says, Elvis invented rock and roll. This isn't accurate. As we've discussed, the musical elements that became rock and roll had been developing for years, through jump blues, through rhythm and blues, through recordings like Rocket 88, made by black musicians who received far less recognition and far less financial reward for their foundational contributions. But the other overly simple version sometimes goes too far in the opposite direction, suggesting Elvis's success was purely a matter of a white performer being given credit for a black art form with no genuine talent or contribution of his own. And this version doesn't fully capture the actual historical complexity either. Elvis Presley was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily talented performer, with a genuine and deep love for the blues, gospel, and country music traditions he'd grown up surrounded by in Mississippi and Tennessee. And there's a detail here that I think is genuinely important and often gets lost. When Chuck Berry, the same Chuck Berry who'd had a national hit with Maybellin in the summer of 1955, a full 6 months before Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel became a #1 hit, was asked about Elvis's role. Berry's own framing was genuinely interesting. Rather than crediting a single white performer with popularizing rock and roll, Berry credited the young, post-war white teenage audience itself, saying something to the effect that white teenagers of that era helped launch black artists nationally into what he called the main line of power music. I think Berry's framing here is genuinely insightful, and it gets at something important. What happened in the mid-1950s wasn't simply a white performer took a black art form. What happened was that a combination of factors. Sam Phillips's genuine belief in this music, Elvis's genuine talent and genuine love for these traditions, a young, white teenage audience that was hungry for music, that felt more exciting and more rebellious than what their parents listened to, and a radio and record industry that was slowly and unevenly starting to break down some of the rigid racial categories that had previously kept race records and mainstream popular music separate. All of these factors combined to create a genuine explosion, one that brought massive new attention and massive new audiences to musical traditions that black musicians had been developing for decades, while also, undeniably, channeling a disproportionate amount of the resulting fame and financial reward toward white performers. Historians still argue about how to weigh all of these factors against each other, and I don't think there's a clean, simple resolution to that argument, because it involves genuinely contested questions about credit, about fairness, about how cultural change actually happens, and about the specific economic and social structures of the music industry in 1950s America. What I think we can say with confidence is this. By 1955, with Chuck Berry's Maybelline, Little Richard's Tutti Frutti, Bo Diddley's self-titled song introducing what became known as the Bo Diddley beat, Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame, and Elvis Presley's emerging career all happening within the same remarkable year, something had genuinely shifted. Radio disc jockeys were calling this music rock and roll. Teenagers, a demographic that was, itself, becoming a genuinely new and powerful force in American culture and consumer life during this post-war period. We're embracing it with an intensity that, as we'll discuss next, would lead directly to some of the most dramatic cultural confrontations of the entire century. So here we are at 1955, with rock and roll exploding into mainstream American culture. And think about what this actually meant in real, lived terms for the people experiencing it. Imagine being a teenager in 1955. Your parents grew up listening to big band swing music, or to the more polished, orchestrated pop vocalists who dominated the charts through the 1940s. Performers whose music was, generally speaking, smooth, controlled, and designed for adult sensibilities. And suddenly, on the radio, you're hearing something completely different. Driving rhythms, electric guitars, lyrics about dancing in cars and teenage romance, vocal performances that sounded raw and urgent in ways that the smooth pop crooners of the previous generation simply didn't. For many parents and cultural authorities of the era, this new sound wasn't just different music. It was genuinely alarming. Rock and roll was associated, in the minds of many adults, with rebellion, with sexuality, with a breakdown of the social order. And here's where I think it's worth being honest about something that runs underneath a lot of this anxiety. A significant portion of the discomfort that rock and roll generated among white adult audiences was directly connected to its roots in black musical traditions. Traditions that, as we've discussed, had been deliberately kept separate from mainstream white popular culture for decades through the segregated structure of the recording industry and radio programming. When white teenagers started embracing music with these roots, enthusiastically and in huge numbers, it represented, to many adults, not just a generational shift in musical taste, but something that felt, to them, like a genuinely threatening blurring of the racial boundaries that had structured American society. I want to be careful not to overstate this. There were plenty of other factors driving adult anxiety about rock and roll too, including just the general, almost universal pattern of older generations being suspicious of whatever music younger generations embrace. But the racial dimension of this particular cultural conflict was real, and it's part of why rock and roll's rise in the mid-1950s coincided with, and became genuinely entangled with, the broader civil rights movement that was gaining momentum during this exact same period. Music and social change were happening simultaneously, and they influenced each other in ways that are genuinely difficult to fully untangle. Let's talk now about one of the genuinely transformative technological developments of this period, because I think technology doesn't get enough credit in most popular tellings of music history. And yet technology has, again and again throughout tonight's journey, been one of the most important forces shaping how music develops and spreads. The solid-body electric guitar. As opposed to earlier electric guitars that were essentially acoustic guitars with electronic pickups added, became commercially available during this period, and it transformed what guitarists could do. A solid-body electric guitar could be played at much higher volumes without the feedback and distortion problems that plagued earlier, amplified acoustic instruments, which meant guitarists could finally compete, sonically, with horn sections and full bands in a live setting. This technological shift is part of why the electric guitar became such a central, almost iconic instrument in rock and roll. It simply wasn't physically possible, before this technology existed, for a guitar to occupy the sonic space that it occupies in rock music. And alongside the electric guitar, another piece of technology mattered enormously: the transistor radio. Before transistor radios became widely affordable, radios were large, often expensive pieces of furniture that sat in a family's living room, meaning that, in practice, parents often had significant control over what music got played in the home. Transistor radios were small, portable, and cheap enough that teenagers could own their own radios, listen in their bedrooms, take them outside, share them with friends, completely outside of parental supervision or control. This technological shift, more than almost anything else, is part of why rock and roll became so specifically associated with youth culture and youth rebellion. For the first time, young people had genuine, private access to music of their own choosing on a mass scale. Now, let's broaden our view for a moment, because while rock and roll was exploding in the mid-1950s, country music was undergoing its own significant developments, building on the foundations laid back in Bristol in 1927. Nashville continued solidifying its position as the genre's commercial center, and country music developed its own stars, its own sound, its own institutions, including, as we mentioned, the Grand Ole Opry radio program, which had become a genuine cultural institution by this point. One development worth mentioning here is the emergence of what's sometimes called the Nashville sound, a style that, in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, moved country music towards smoother, more polished, more orchestrated production, incorporating string sections and background vocal groups in a deliberate effort to make country music more commercially palatable to mainstream pop audiences. This represents a pattern we're going to see again and again, a genre that started as something raw and regional, gradually becoming more polished and commercially oriented as it sought wider audiences. And, as always happens with this kind of evolution, this shift generated genuine debate among musicians and fans about whether this represented healthy growth or a loss of authenticity. Let's also touch on something happening in this same general period that connects back to a thread we discussed in our very first section: jazz. By the 1940s and into the 1950s, jazz had been through several transformations of its own. The big band swing sound of the 1930s and early 1940s, large ensembles playing tightly arranged music for dancing, gave way, in the 1940s, to a new style called bebop, characterized by faster tempos, more complex harmonies, and a shift towards small groups featuring virtuosic improvised solos, often performed for listening rather than dancing. Musicians like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie became central figures in this transformation. This shift from big band swing to bebop is genuinely significant for understanding jazz's place in American culture, because it represented jazz moving away from being primarily popular dance music, the kind of thing that filled ballrooms, towards something closer to what we might think of as an art form intended for serious listening and appreciation. This shift had real consequences. Jazz became, in some ways, more artistically ambitious and more respected by critics and serious music scholars. But it also became, in commercial terms, less central to mainstream popular culture than it had been during the swing era, when big bands were genuinely some of the most popular entertainment in the country. I think this pattern, a genre moving from mass popularity towards something more artistically ambitious but commercially narrower, is one we'll see in various forms throughout the rest of tonight's journey, and I think it's worth holding on to as a kind of recurring shape in how American music genres tend to evolve over time. An initial period of broad, often unpretentious popular appeal, followed, for at least some portion of artists and audiences within that genre, by a kind of artistic maturation that can sometimes come at the cost of that original mass appeal. Even as, simultaneously, some other genre is often emerging to fill the mass popular music role that the earlier genre has moved away from. Now let's bring our attention to something genuinely important that was developing during this exact same period, in a city we haven't spent much time with yet: Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, in the post-war decades, was a city defined by its automobile industry. The assembly lines of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler employed enormous numbers of people, including large numbers of African Americans who had moved to Detroit as part of that same Great Migration we discussed earlier. And it's in this specific context, a city built around industrial assembly lines with a large, vibrant African American community, that one of the most influential record labels in American history was about to be founded. In January of 1959, a man named Berry Gordy Jr., who had previously worked on an actual automobile assembly line in Detroit and who had found some early success as a songwriter, writing hits like Lonely Teardrops for a singer named Jackie Wilson, used an $800 loan from his family to start a record label. He originally called it Tamla Records. Later that same year, he established a publishing company called Joe Beatty, named using letters from his children's names, and by the end of 1959, he'd formed what would become known as Motown Record Corporation. The name itself, a portmanteau combining motor and town, a direct reference to Detroit's identity as the Motor City. Gordy's approach to running Motown was genuinely distinctive, and I think it deserves real attention because it represents something different from how most of the music we've discussed so far developed. Where the blues, early jazz, and early rock and roll had largely emerged organically, from communities, from regional scenes, from individual musicians developing their own styles somewhat independently. Gordy approached making hit records with something closer to the systematic mindset of the assembly lines he'd worked on. He famously envisioned something like an assembly line process for creating polished, commercially successful pop stars, which meant paying close attention not just to the music itself, but to every other element of an artist's presentation: their clothing, their choreography, their public behavior, all carefully managed to project a particular image. Motown's first major hit was a song called Money, That's What I Want, recorded by Barrett Strong in 1959, and there's a genuinely fun piece of trivia connected to this song. It was later covered by the Beatles in 1963, which gives you a sense of just how quickly Motown's influence began reaching across the Atlantic into what was about to become one of the most significant musical relationships in the history of popular music: the relationship between American music and British musicians who'd grown up listening to it. Motown built its sound around something called the Funk Brothers, an in-house group of session musicians drawn from some of the best players in Detroit's nightclub and bar scene, who played on an enormous number of Motown recordings, providing a consistent musical foundation across releases by many different featured artists. This is genuinely similar to something we mentioned briefly with other labels of this era. The idea of a label having its own house band that gave all of its recordings a certain underlying sonic consistency, even as different singers and different songwriting teams worked on top of that foundation. Over the following decade, Motown's roster would include some of the most significant names in American popular music: the Supremes, the Temptations, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Marvin Gaye, and, starting in 1969, a young vocal group called the Jackson 5, featuring a child singer named Michael Jackson, who would go on to become, by most measures, one of the most commercially successful and culturally influential musicians in the entire history of recorded music. What Motown represented, in the broader sweep of our story tonight, was something genuinely significant. An African-American owned and African-American run record label achieving mainstream, crossover commercial success on an enormous scale, not just within race records categories, but on the main pop charts, reaching white audiences as well as black audiences, becoming, in a very real sense, part of the soundtrack of an entire decade for essentially all of America, regardless of race. This represented genuine progress in terms of African-American ownership and control within the music industry. Though, as with so much of what we've discussed tonight, the broader story of who controlled the financial rewards, the publishing rights, and the long-term wealth generated by this music remains a genuinely complicated and sometimes contested part of the history, even for an operation as successful and as celebrated as Motown. So as we move toward the next major chapter of our story, and I promise you, the 1960s have an enormous amount in store, including a moment when British musicians who'd grown up obsessively listening to American blues, rock and roll, and Motown records would come back across the Atlantic and reshape American music all over again. I want you to hold on to this image. By the start of the 1960s, we've got rock and roll established as a genuine cultural force, country music developing its own smoother Nashville sound, jazz pushing toward more artistically ambitious territory with bebop and Motown in Detroit, building what would become one of the most influential sounds and most successful independent labels in American history, using an approach to making music that was genuinely inspired by the assembly lines of the automobile industry that employed so much of that city. We're now standing at the threshold of the 1960s, and I want to take a moment to set the scene properly, because this decade is going to bring together almost every thread we've discussed so far: folk traditions, blues, country, Motown soul, and rock and roll, and throw them all into a genuinely turbulent, transformative mixing pot against the backdrop of a country going through some of the most significant social and political changes in its entire history. Let's start with folk music, because remember, back in our very first section, we talked about the ballad traditions that settlers brought from the British Isles into the Appalachian Mountains, traditions that eventually fed into country music's development at Bristol in 1927. Well, that older folk tradition, the unaccompanied or simply accompanied ballads, the storytelling songs, the music of the people in the most literal sense, never actually disappeared. It had continued, in various forms, throughout the decades we've covered, often preserved by folklorists and musicologists who traveled around documenting and recording traditional musicians, much like Ralph Peer had done, though usually for academic or archival purposes rather than commercial ones. By the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, this older folk tradition experienced what's often called a folk revival. Younger, often urban and college-educated musicians began performing and recording their own versions of traditional folk songs, as well as writing new songs in a folk style, often with lyrics that engaged directly with contemporary social and political issues. This folk revival became deeply intertwined with the civil rights movement and with broader currents of political protest during this period. Folk songs became, for many people, a way of expressing and processing the genuinely momentous social changes happening around them. The single most significant figure to emerge from this folk revival was a young man who'd taken the stage name Bob Dylan. And remember that connection we mentioned earlier to Muddy Waters' song Rollin' Stone? Dylan's song Like a Rolling Stone, released in 1965, represents a genuinely pivotal moment, not just for Dylan personally, but for the broader relationship between folk music and rock music. Dylan had built his reputation as an acoustic folk performer, closely associated with the protest song tradition. When he began performing with electric instrumentation, most famously and controversially at a folk festival in 1965, where reports describe a portion of the audience reacting with genuine anger and a sense of betrayal at hearing their acoustic folk hero playing electric rock instrumentation. It represented, symbolically, a kind of collision between the folk tradition's association with authenticity and simplicity, and rock music's association with commercial mainstream success and amplified, electric sound. I think this moment is genuinely worth sitting with, because it illustrates something we've touched on throughout tonight's journey. The tension between musical traditions that position themselves as authentic or pure, and the broader commercial and technological currents that, again and again, end up reshaping those traditions, whether purists like it or not. Folk music's relationship with authenticity. The idea that certain instruments, certain performance styles, certain levels of commercial success represent a kind of betrayal of a tradition's true spirit, is a debate that, in various forms, recurs throughout the history of basically every genre we've discussed tonight, from the Nashville Sounds polish in country music to debates we'll encounter later about hip-hop's commercialization. Now, let's cross the Atlantic Ocean, because we need to talk about something that, on the surface, might seem like a detour from American music. But that turns out to be absolutely essential to understanding what happened next. Throughout the 1950s, young musicians in Britain had been listening, with genuine passion and obsession, to American blues, rhythm and blues, and early rock and roll records. Often records that were, at the time, relatively obscure within America itself, particularly recordings by black blues musicians, whose music hadn't necessarily crossed over to mainstream white American audiences. British teenagers, through various means. American servicemen stationed in Britain imported records, radio broadcasts that could sometimes be picked up across the English Channel, gained access to this music, and fell in love with it. By the early 1960s, several British bands had formed, built directly on this foundation of American blues and rock and roll, but filtering it through their own perspectives and adding their own innovations. The most famous of these, of course, were the Beatles. And remember, we mentioned that Motown's first hit, Money, That's What I Want, was covered by the Beatles in 1963, just a few years after it was originally recorded in Detroit. That's not an isolated example. British bands of this era covered enormous amounts of American blues, R&B, and rock and roll material, sometimes introducing these songs to wider audiences than the original American recordings had ever reached, including, in some cases, introducing American audiences themselves to music that had originally been made by American musicians but that hadn't achieved mainstream success in its country of origin, when the Beatles and other British bands, including the Rolling Stones, whose very name, as we discussed, traces back to that Muddy Waters song, achieved massive commercial success in the United States starting in 1964 in what's often called the British Invasion. It created a genuinely fascinating cultural loop. American musical traditions, blues, rock and roll, Motown soul, had traveled to Britain, been absorbed and reinterpreted by British musicians, and then traveled back to America, where they achieved a level of mainstream commercial success that sometimes exceeded what the original American sources had achieved. I think this is one of the most genuinely important things to understand about the global spread of American music more broadly, and it's a pattern that's going to recur. American musical innovations frequently travel outward, get absorbed and transformed by musicians in other countries, and then travel back to America, often in forms that achieve greater commercial success than the original versions did, creating a kind of ongoing international conversation where it becomes genuinely difficult to draw clean lines around what's American music versus music that's been shaped by international influences and feedback loops. The British invasion also had a genuinely significant effect on American musicians themselves. Many American rock musicians of the mid to late 1960s have described the impact of seeing British bands achieve such massive success with music that was, in its DNA, deeply rooted in American blues and rock and roll traditions as a kind of wake-up call, prompting many American musicians to engage more directly and more seriously with these same roots traditions. Let's also talk about something that was happening in soul music during this period, building on the foundation Motown had established. While Motown, based in Detroit, developed its polished, pop crossover sound, another genuinely important strand of soul music was developing with a roar, more gospel-influenced, more emotionally intense quality. Often associated with record labels based in the American South, particularly in places like Memphis. This Southern soul tradition drew even more directly from gospel music's vocal traditions, the kind of impassioned, almost preaching vocal style that had developed in black churches, and from rhythm and blues, creating a sound that was, in some ways, raw and more emotionally direct than Motown's more polished pop approach. I want to mention one specific figure here who I think deserves real attention. Aretha Franklin, whose career really took off in the latter half of the 1960s, and whose music, drawing on her own background growing up in the church with a father who was himself a prominent preacher, represents, for many people, the absolute pinnacle of soul music's combination of gospel-rooted vocal power and secular subject matter. Franklin's recordings from this period have been described by countless critics and musicians as among the greatest vocal performances in the history of recorded music, and her later honorific title, Queen of Soul, reflects the genuinely towering status she achieved within American music. Now, let's also touch on funk, because this genre, which developed in the latter half of the 1960s and really flourished into the 1970s, represents another genuinely important strand of African American musical innovation during this period. Funk took the rhythmic emphasis that had always been central to African American music, going all the way back to those African rhythmic traditions we discussed in our very first section, and pushed it to a new level of prominence, with songs often built around incredibly precise, syncopated rhythmic patterns, particularly in the bass and drums, sometimes with relatively minimal melodic or harmonic development by comparison, because the rhythm itself was the point. James Brown is the figure most centrally associated with funk's development, and here's a connection that's genuinely worth pausing on, because it's going to become enormously important later in tonight's journey. James Brown's records, with their incredibly distinctive, isolated rhythmic breaks, moments where the full band would drop away, leaving just drums or drums and bass, playing an intensely rhythmic pattern, would become, decades later, some of the most important raw material for an entirely new genre of music that was about to be born in New York City. Let's bring all of this together as we approach the end of the 1960s. By this point in our story, we've got folk music experiencing a revival deeply tied to political protest and civil rights. Rock music having absorbed massive influence from a British invasion that was itself built on earlier American blues and rock and roll. Motown's polished soul sound continuing to dominate the pop charts, a raw, gospel-influenced Southern soul tradition producing some of the greatest vocal performances in recorded music history, and funk pushing rhythmic intensity to new heights, laying down musical foundations that wouldn't be fully built upon for several more years. And all of this was happening against the backdrop of a decade defined by the civil rights movement, by the Vietnam War, and the protest movements opposing it, by genuinely significant generational conflict between young people and their parents' generation, and by a sense, for many people living through this period, that American society itself was undergoing fundamental, perhaps even unprecedented, transformation. Music, throughout this decade, wasn't just a soundtrack to these changes. In countless ways, it was actively part of how these changes were expressed, processed, and, in some cases, actively driven forward. The musicians of the 1960s weren't just reflecting their era. In many genuine ways, they were helping to create it. As we move into the early 1970s, I want to take you to a place we've actually already visited tonight, though under very different circumstances. Remember the Bronx, that borough of New York City we haven't formally introduced yet, but that's about to become the setting for one of the single most consequential moments in the entire history of American music. But before we get there, let's spend some time with what was happening in the broader musical landscape of the early to mid-1970s, because this period is genuinely rich with developments that deserve attention. Funk, which we discussed at the end of our previous section as something James Brown had been pioneering through the late 1960s, absolutely exploded in popularity and influence during the 1970s. Bands built entire careers around the kind of intensely rhythmic, bass and drum-driven sound that funk had established. And this music became enormously popular, not just on the radio and on records, but in dance clubs, where the combination of repetitive, hypnotic rhythms and extended instrumental sections made for music that people could dance to for long stretches without interruption. And that connection to dance clubs leads us directly to disco, a genre that emerged in the early to mid-1970s, drawing on funk's rhythmic foundations but adding lush orchestral arrangements, often featuring string sections and sweeping melodic lines, along with a steady, four-on-the-floor beat that became almost a signature of the genre. Disco became enormously, almost dominantly popular by the mid to late 1970s, to the point where it became, for a period, perhaps the single most commercially successful style of popular music in America, filling dance floors across the country and producing some of the best-selling records of the decade. Disco's cultural significance goes well beyond just its musical characteristics, though. Disco culture was deeply associated with spaces, nightclubs, dance floors, that provided genuinely important social spaces for communities that had often been marginalized in mainstream American culture, including LGBTQ communities and communities of color. The dance floor, in disco culture, functioned as a kind of liberating space where people could express themselves through dance and music in ways that felt freer than much of the rest of their lives allowed. I want to be honest, though, that disco also generated genuine backlash during this period. A backlash that, looking back, many cultural historians have noted carried uncomfortable undertones related to race, sexuality, and class, with disco's detractors often expressing their dislike in terms that seem to be about more than just musical taste. This backlash culminated in some genuinely strange and, frankly, somewhat embarrassing moments in American cultural history, including an infamous event at a baseball stadium where thousands of disco records were destroyed as part of a promotional stunt that ended in genuine chaos. I mention this not to dwell on it, but because I think it's a genuine example of how musical taste in America has often become entangled with much larger social anxieties and conflicts. Something we've seen repeatedly tonight, going all the way back to the moral panic some adults felt about rock and roll in the 1950s. Now, let's also talk about what was happening in rock music more broadly during this period, because the 1970s saw rock splinter into an enormous number of different subgenres and styles, each developing its own identity, its own audience, and its own sound. Hard rock and what would eventually be called heavy metal developed louder, heavier, more aggressive sounds, often built around powerful guitar riffs and intense vocal performances. Progressive rock pushed in the opposite direction in some ways, incorporating longer song structures, more complex compositions, and influences from classical music and jazz. Singer-songwriters, building on the folk tradition we discussed earlier, created intimate, often introspective music focused on personal storytelling. This proliferation of subgenres within rock during the 1970s is, I think, a genuinely important pattern to notice, because it's going to happen again with other genres later in our story. As a genre becomes more commercially successful and reaches a wider audience, it tends to splinter into more specialized subgenres, each appealing to somewhat different segments of that broader audience. A kind of musical specialization that happens almost naturally as audiences grow large enough to support multiple distinct styles simultaneously. Now, let's get back to the Bronx, because it's time to talk about one of the most genuinely important moments in tonight's entire journey. By the early 1970s, the Bronx was, in many ways, a borough facing genuine economic hardship, a period of urban struggle, with many of the social and economic challenges that affected American cities during this era hitting the Bronx particularly hard. But within this environment, something genuinely creative and transformative was beginning to take shape, emerging from young people, many of them African, American, and Latino, finding ways to express themselves and build community through music, dance, and art, often using whatever resources they had available. The central figure in this story is a man named Clive Campbell, who'd been born in Kingston, Jamaica, in 1955, and who'd moved to the Bronx as a child, where he eventually earned the nickname Hercules because of his athletic build. A nickname that got shortened over time to Herc and combined with Cool to create the stage name by which he'd become known, DJ Kool Herc. Campbell's father was an avid record collector, and growing up, young Clive was exposed to an enormous range of musical genres and styles: jazz, funk, gospel, and, crucially, the sounds of his native Jamaica, including a tradition called toasting, where a DJ would speak. Essentially rap. Improvised rhymes over the music being played, a tradition with deep roots in Jamaican sound system culture. When Campbell moved to the Bronx, he began DJing at house parties, and he started developing a particular style. One built around playing what he called hard funk records, the kind of music typified by James Brown, the same James Brown whose isolated rhythmic breaks we mentioned at the end of our previous section as being so important. Here's the genuinely revolutionary innovation, and I want to walk through it carefully, because it's one of the most consequential musical innovations in the entire history of American, and really, world, popular music. Campbell noticed something about how dancers responded to the records he was playing. They responded most intensely, with the most energy, during specific moments in songs. Moments often called breaks, where the full band would drop away, leaving just the drums, or drums and bass, playing an intensely rhythmic pattern before the rest of the instruments came back in. These breaks were typically quite short, just a few seconds within a much longer song. But Campbell realized that if he could somehow extend these breaks, make that few seconds of pure rhythm last much longer, the dancers would respond even more intensely. So, using the same two-turntable setup that disco DJs of this era were using, Campbell developed a technique using two copies of the exact same record. He would play the break on one turntable, and just as it was about to end, he'd switch to the second turntable, which had the needle position to play the exact same break again from the beginning. And by going back and forth between these two copies of the same record, he could extend a few-second break into a continuous, ongoing rhythmic loop that could last for minutes. This technique, using two copies of the same record to isolate and extend the break, is now recognized as the foundational technical innovation of what would become hip-hop music. The break itself gave rise to the term break dancing or b-boying, referring to the style of dance that developed specifically to be performed during these extended rhythmic sections. And Campbell didn't just play music silently. Drawing on that Jamaican toasting tradition, he would speak over the music, making announcements, encouraging dancers, calling out phrases that would become genuinely iconic within the culture that grew up around this music. Phrases that, over time, would evolve into the more elaborate, rhythmic, rhyming vocal style that we now call rapping. All of these elements, the breakbeat DJing technique, the rhyming vocal style derived from toasting, the b-boying dance style that developed in response to extended breaks, and a visual art tradition involving graffiti that was developing in the same communities during this same period, came together as what's now recognized as the four foundational elements of hip-hop culture: DJing, rapping or MCing, b-boying or breakdancing, and graffiti art. And here's the date, the specific moment that's now recognized as the official birth of hip-hop, August 11th, 1973. On that date, Clive Campbell, DJ Kool Herc, served as the DJ for a party held in the recreation room of an apartment building at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx. The party was actually organized by his younger sister, Cindy Campbell, as a back-to-school party. The kind of community event that, on the surface, might seem like an entirely unremarkable, everyday occurrence. Admission cost 50 cents for boys and 25 cents for girls, with the proceeds going towards Cindy's back-to-school clothes shopping. I think this detail, that one of the most historically significant musical events of the entire 20th century was, on its surface, just a teenager's birthday-adjacent back-to-school party, with admission prices set specifically so a younger sister could afford new clothes for school, is genuinely one of my favorite details in all of tonight's journey, because it connects directly back to something. I said earlier about the Bristol sessions in 1927. Nobody at the time had any idea they were witnessing history. This was just a party. It was successful. Campbell had his most powerful sound system yet, and the biggest crowd he'd ever performed for. And the breakbeat style he'd been developing and refining for roughly a year clearly resonated powerfully with that crowd. But this is the birth of an art form that will eventually be worth tens of billions of dollars and will become one of the most globally dominant musical genres on the planet, was almost certainly not a thought running through anyone's mind that night. I do want to add one note of nuance here, because it's the kind of thing I think deserves honest acknowledgement. While DJ Kool Herc's party on August 11th, 1973, is the specific moment most widely recognized as hip-hop's official birth, some hip-hop historians describe what happened as part of a broader Holy Trinity alongside two other genuinely important early figures, Grandmaster Flash and Afrika Bambaataa, each of whom made their own significant contributions to the culture's early development. So while Kool Herc's party represents the specific, dateable moment that gets pointed to as the beginning, the fuller picture, as is so often the case in tonight's journey, involves multiple people contributing different innovations in roughly the same time and place. A genuine community of creativity, even if one specific moment gets singled out as the symbolic birthday. Historians still argue, by the way, about how much credit should go to this specific Jamaican-influenced sound system culture versus other influences that were happening simultaneously in the Bronx and elsewhere in New York. But what's genuinely beyond dispute is that something happened in the Bronx in the early to mid-1970s that hadn't existed before, that drew on funk, on Jamaican sound system traditions, on the creative energy of young people in a community facing real economic hardship, and that would go on, over the following decades, to become one of the most influential cultural forces, not just musically, but in terms of fashion, language, visual art, and broader culture, that the world has ever seen. And here's a cheeky thought for you, the kind of, you probably won't survive this moment I promised earlier tonight. If you'd been at that party at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue on August 11th, 1973, and someone had told you that, 50 years later, people would still be talking about this exact event, that the building itself would eventually be recognized as a historically significant site, that the music being played that night would evolve into a genre that artists across the entire world, in dozens of languages, would still be making, you probably wouldn't have believed it. And honestly, if you tried explaining hip-hop's eventual global, multi-billion-dollar scale to anyone at that party, using terms and concepts from 2026, streaming numbers, global charts, the sheer scale of what this music would become, I suspect you'd have a genuinely hard time making yourself understood. Not because the people there weren't smart, but because the scale of what was about to happen was, at that moment, simply unimaginable. So as we move forward from this moment, the Bronx, 1973, two turntables, and a community of young people creating something genuinely new. I want you to hold this image alongside everything else we've discussed tonight. New England meeting houses, Mississippi Delta cotton fields, New Orleans funeral processions, a hat warehouse in Bristol, Tennessee, Chicago blues clubs, a converted building in Detroit with a sign reading Hitsville, USA, and now a recreation room in an apartment building in the Bronx. Each of these places, at the time, was just an ordinary place where ordinary people were making music for reasons that felt, to them, completely unremarkable, to express themselves, to make a living, to have fun, to help a younger sister buy school clothes. And each of these ordinary moments turned out to be a hinge point in the history of American music, a moment where something genuinely new came into existence and began, slowly or quickly, to reshape everything that came after. Let's continue moving through the late 1970s and into the 1980s now, because this period brings together several threads we've been following. Hip-hop's early development in the Bronx, the splintering of rock into countless subgenres, and a genuinely massive technological shift that's about to change not just how music sounds, but how people experience it. After that party at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in 1973, hip-hop continued developing throughout the rest of the 1970s, largely as what's often described as a live phenomenon. Something that happened at parties, in parks, in community centers, passed along through direct experience and word of mouth, rather than something most people encountered through records or radio. For several years, hip-hop existed almost entirely outside the commercial recording industry, which is a genuinely interesting parallel to something we discussed much earlier tonight. Remember how the blues, in its earliest decades, existed largely outside the recording industry too, developing and evolving in juke joints and homes for years before anyone thought to record it? This pattern, a genuinely new musical form developing for years, sometimes even decades, in community settings before the commercial recording industry takes notice, is one we've now seen repeat itself across multiple genres tonight, and I think it tells us something important about how musical innovation actually happens versus how it gets remembered. The official recorded history of a genre often starts later than the genre itself actually began, which means that some of the most genuinely creative, foundational developmental work happens in a kind of historical shadow, witnessed only by the people who were actually there. By the late 1970s, hip-hop began making its way onto records, and this period also saw the broader musical landscape continuing to diversify in genuinely significant ways. Let's talk about punk rock, which emerged in the mid to late 1970s as a genuinely dramatic reaction against what some musicians and audiences saw as the increasingly bloated, overproduced state of mainstream rock music. Remember our discussion of progressive rock's longer, more complex compositions? Punk represented, in many ways, a direct rejection of that complexity, embracing instead short songs, simple chord structures, raw and often deliberately unpolished production, and lyrics that frequently express genuine frustration with mainstream culture and politics. Punk's do-it-yourself ethos, the idea that you didn't need elaborate technical skill or expensive equipment to make meaningful music, that genuine passion and a clear point of view mattered more than polish, would go on to influence countless musicians and movements in the decades that followed, including, in some genuinely interesting ways, aspects of hip-hop's own development, which similarly emphasized that creativity and innovation could come from people without access to expensive instruments or formal musical training, using whatever tools, turntables, in hip-hop's case, happened to be available. Punk also gave rise to what's often called new wave music in the late 1970s and early 1980s. A genre that took some of punk's energy and DIY spirit, but combined it with more melodic sensibilities and, increasingly, with new electronic instruments that were becoming available during this period, particularly synthesizers and early drum machines. And this brings us to one of the genuinely most important technological and cultural developments of the entire 1980s. The launch of a television channel in 1981 dedicated entirely to playing music videos around the clock. This channel transformed the music industry in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. Before this point, music had been primarily an audio experience. You heard it on the radio, on records, in concert. Suddenly, visual presentation became enormously, sometimes even primarily, important to an artist's success. How you looked, how you moved, what kind of visual story you could tell in a 3 to 4 minute video. These factors became central to commercial success in ways they simply hadn't been before. This shift had an enormous impact on several artists who became defining figures of the 1980s, and I want to spend some real time on one figure in particular, because his career genuinely embodies so many threads we've discussed tonight, and because his impact on global popular culture is, by almost any measure, simply staggering. Remember the Jackson 5, the Motown act we mentioned briefly that included a young singer named Michael Jackson, signed to Motown starting in 1969? By the early 1980s, Michael Jackson had become a solo artist, and his career during this decade represents, in many ways, the absolute peak of what the combination of musical talent, visual presentation through music videos, and the by now decades-long traditions of African-American musical innovation we've traced throughout tonight could achieve in terms of global commercial success and cultural influence. Jackson's music during this period drew on virtually every thread we've discussed. The rhythmic foundations of funk, the polished pop sensibilities that Motown had pioneered, the vocal traditions of soul and gospel, all combined with genuinely innovative dance choreography and some of the most memorable, elaborately produced music videos ever made. His success during this decade has been described by many music historians and industry observers as representing a kind of globalization of American popular music in a way that hadn't quite happened at this scale before. His music and his image became recognized literally around the world, in countries where American popular music had previously had much more limited reach. I want to mention another defining figure of this era as well. Madonna, whose career, like Jackson's, was deeply intertwined with the new visual culture that music videos created, and whose music drew on dance music traditions, including, genuinely, some direct lineage from the disco and dance club culture of the previous decade, combined with a genuinely sophisticated understanding of image, reinvention, and provocation as central elements of a pop career. The 1980s, in many ways, established a template. Pop stardom built around the combination of music, image, choreography, and carefully managed public persona that would influence how pop music careers were built for decades afterward. Now, let's also touch on country music during this period, because the 1980s saw genuinely interesting developments in this genre too. Building on the Nashville sound polish we discussed earlier from the 1950s and 1960s, Country music in the 1980s saw various movements both toward and away from mainstream pop crossover appeal. Some artists, in some periods within the decade, leaned toward what's sometimes called a more traditional or neo-traditional sound, deliberately referencing the earlier, rootsier sounds of artists like the Carter Family and Jimmy Rogers that we discussed back at Bristol in 1927, while other artists and other moments leaned toward even greater pop crossover than the Nashville sound had achieved decades earlier. This back and forth between traditional or roots approaches and more pop-oriented crossover approaches is, I think, another one of those recurring patterns we've now identified multiple times tonight. It happened with jazz moving from swing to bebop and the tensions that created. It happened with folk music's relationship to Dylan going electric. It's happening in various forms within country music across these decades. And we're going to see it again in genuinely significant ways with hip-hop in the years ahead. Let's go back to hip-hop now, because by the early to mid-1980s, this genre, which, remember, had spent years developing as a largely live, community-based phenomenon before making its way onto records, was beginning to achieve genuine mainstream commercial success, with early hip-hop records reaching national audiences and charts for the first time. The genre was also continuing to develop its musical vocabulary in genuinely innovative ways, including the increasing use of new electronic instruments, drum machines, and early sampling technology, which allowed artists to take small portions of existing recordings, including, often, those funk breaks we discussed, the same kinds of breaks DJ Kool Herc had been extending using 2 turntables, and incorporate them directly into new recordings. This use of sampling, taking pieces of existing recordings and building new music around them, represents, I think, a genuinely fascinating continuation of something we've discussed multiple times tonight. The idea that musical traditions are rarely created from nothing, that they almost always involve some form of borrowing, referencing, and recombining existing material in new ways. We talked about Chuck Berry copying Carl Hogan's guitar intro note for note. We talked about old British ballads having their lyrics changed to reflect American experiences while keeping their basic melodic structures. Sampling, in hip-hop, represents this same fundamental creative process, taking existing material and recombining it into something new, but made explicit, made into a central, celebrated technique of the genre itself, rather than something that happened more quietly or informally as it had in earlier genres. This explicitness about sampling did create genuinely significant legal and economic questions that the music industry had to work through during this period and in the years that followed. Questions about copyright, about how to credit and compensate the original creators of sampled material. Questions that, frankly, the industry is still working through in various ways, even today. But musically and culturally, sampling represented something genuinely powerful. A way for hip-hop artists to draw direct, audible connections to the musical traditions that had come before them. Funk, soul, jazz, even, in some cases, rock. Building new music explicitly on top of older music, creating a kind of layered, intergenerational conversation within the music itself. As we move toward the end of the 1980s, I want to set up something we're going to discuss in much more depth in our next section, because it's genuinely significant. Hip-hop, during the late 1980s, began developing in directions that were, in some cases, considerably more lyrically direct and confrontational than its earlier years. Addressing social and political issues, including issues related to urban poverty, policing, and racial inequality, with a directness that generated both enormous cultural impact and, in some cases, genuine controversy and backlash, in ways that, again, echo patterns we've discussed throughout tonight regarding how new musical movements rooted in African American communities have often generated anxiety or backlash from broader mainstream culture, even while simultaneously achieving massive commercial success. So as we close out this section, here's where things stand as we approach the 1990s. Hip-hop has moved from a live, community-based phenomenon to a major commercial force, incorporating new technologies like sampling and drum machines while maintaining deep connections to the funk, soul, and rhythmic traditions that came before it. Pop music has been reshaped by the visual culture of music videos, with figures like Michael Jackson and Madonna achieving a level of global reach that previous generations of American musicians, however influential, simply hadn't achieved at quite this scale. Punk and new wave have introduced new sounds and a new DIY ethos that will continue influencing music for decades. And country music continues its ongoing negotiation between traditional roots and pop crossover appeal. Every single one of these threads is about to be tested, challenged, and transformed again as we move into a decade that's going to bring genuinely significant new sounds, new technologies, and, as has happened so many times throughout tonight's journey, genuinely significant new controversies about authenticity, ownership, and what American music is supposed to sound like. Let's step into the 1990s now, a decade that brought genuinely dramatic shifts across nearly every genre we've discussed tonight. Shifts that, in some cases, involved entire regions of the country suddenly becoming central to the national musical conversation in ways they hadn't been before, and that, in other cases, involved older sounds being deliberately revived as a kind of reaction against the polish and production values that had come to dominate popular music during the 1980s. Let's start with something that happened in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in and around Seattle, Washington, a part of the country that, frankly, hadn't been a major center of American popular music for most of the story we've told tonight. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a number of bands from this region began developing a sound that combined elements of punk rock's raw energy and DIY ethos. Remember our discussion of punk's rejection of polish and complexity, with the heavier, more aggressive sounds of hard rock and what had become known as heavy metal. This sound came to be called grunge, and it achieved a level of mainstream commercial breakthrough in the early 1990s that genuinely surprised much of the music industry, which had, by this point, become heavily oriented around the kind of glossy, image-conscious pop and rock that had dominated much of the 1980s. Grunge's aesthetic, deliberately unpolished, often featuring musicians in plain, everyday clothing rather than elaborate stage costumes, lyrics often dealing with themes of alienation, frustration, and emotional struggle rather than the more celebratory or aspirational themes common in much 1980s pop, represented, in many ways, exactly the kind of authenticity versus polish pendulum swing we've now discussed multiple times tonight, but happening within rock music specifically, and happening with a speed and a commercial scale that took many people by surprise. This grunge-driven shift is often discussed as part of a broader category, sometimes called alternative rock, a term that, somewhat paradoxically, came to describe music that, for a period in the early to mid-1990s, was actually extremely commercially mainstream, dominating radio airplay and record sales in ways that made the term alternative feel, to some observers, like it had become almost the opposite of what it originally meant. This is, I think, another version of a pattern we've discussed before. A movement that begins as a reaction against the mainstream eventually becoming, itself, the new mainstream, which then, in turn, sets up the conditions for the next reaction against it. Now let's turn to hip-hop, because the 1990s represent, by almost any measure, one of the most genuinely transformative decades in this genre's history. The decade where hip-hop moved from being a major commercial force, as we discussed at the end of our previous section, to becoming, by many measures, the dominant genre in American popular music, a position it has, in various forms, maintained ever since. During the 1990s, hip-hop developed increasingly distinct regional identities, sounds and styles associated specifically with different parts of the country, each with their own characteristic production styles, lyrical themes, and cultural associations. The East Coast, particularly New York, hip-hop's birthplace, as we discussed, continued developing its own sound. But the West Coast, particularly California, developed what became an enormously influential sound of its own during this period, often associated with funk influences. Remember our discussion of funk's development in the late 1960s and 1970s, with its emphasis on rhythmic precision? West Coast hip-hop of this era often drew very directly and very audibly on these funk traditions, sometimes through sampling, sometimes through new musical elements that were clearly in conversation with that funk lineage. This East Coast versus West Coast dynamic became, during the mid-1990s, genuinely significant in ways that went beyond just musical style. There was a real sense, during this period, of rivalry and tension between artists and audiences associated with these different regional scenes, tension that, tragically, contributed to a broader atmosphere that several historians and journalists have connected to genuinely devastating losses within the hip-hop community during this period. The deaths of some of the genre's most significant and influential artists, losses that the hip-hop community and its fans continue to feel and discuss to this day. I want to handle this part of the story with real care and not dwell on the specifics, because I think the broader point, that this period involved genuine human tragedy alongside genuine musical innovation, is important to acknowledge honestly without turning it into entertainment. Beyond this regional dynamic, hip-hop during the 1990s also continued developing its lyrical and thematic range in genuinely significant ways. Building on the more socially and politically direct lyrical approaches that had begun emerging in the late 1980s. As we discussed at the end of our previous section, hip-hop artists throughout the 1990s used the genre to address an enormously wide range of subjects, from social commentary and political critique to storytelling, humor, and increasingly sophisticated, technically virtuosic approaches to rhythm and wordplay within rapping itself. What's sometimes discussed as the development of increasingly complex flow, referring to how a rapper's vocal rhythm interacts with the underlying beat. I want to take a moment here to connect this back to something from much earlier in tonight's journey, because I think it's a genuinely important connection. Remember, way back in our discussion of the blues, we talked about how blues lyrics covered the full range of human experience: love, loss, hardship, humor, joy, with a directness that didn't shy away from difficult subjects. Hip-hop, in many ways, represents a continuation of that same tradition of directness, using music as a vehicle for expressing genuine, often difficult truths about people's actual lives and experiences in a musical and cultural context where other forms of expression might be less accessible or less likely to be heard. The specific musical vocabulary is completely different. The blues' 12-bar structures and slide guitar versus hip-hop's sampled beats and rapped vocals. But the underlying impulse, I'd argue, has genuine continuity. Music as a way of telling the truth about your life in a form that other people can connect with. Now let's shift to country music, because the 1990s saw this genre achieve a level of mainstream commercial success that, in some ways, exceeded anything it had achieved in previous decades. Country music during this period reached audiences well beyond its traditional regional base, with several artists achieving the kind of broad, mainstream pop crossover success that we discussed in earlier decades as one side of that ongoing traditional versus crossover tension within the genre. This commercial explosion brought country music to genuinely massive new audiences, including audiences in parts of the country and demographic groups that hadn't traditionally been major country music consumers. This commercial success, as has happened with basically every genre we've discussed tonight at moments of major mainstream breakthrough, generated its own internal debates about whether this new, more pop-oriented, more commercially massive country music represented healthy growth for the genre, or whether it represented a kind of dilution of what made country music distinctive in the first place. I think, by this point in tonight's journey, you can probably predict that I'm not going to tell you there's a clean resolution to this debate, because, as we've seen again and again, this exact same debate, in slightly different forms, has played out within nearly every genre we've discussed, and it tends to reflect a genuinely difficult underlying tension. The tension between a musical tradition's connection to a specific community or history, and that same tradition's potential to reach and resonate with much broader audiences who may connect with the music for reasons that have less to do with that original specific community or history. Let's also touch on something else that was happening during the 1990s. The continued development of what's sometimes called alternative approaches across multiple genres. Not just the alternative rock we discussed earlier, but also developments in R&B, where artists drew on the deep soul and gospel traditions we discussed earlier in the evening, combined with the production techniques and rhythmic sensibilities that hip-hop had developed, creating new hybrid sounds that drew on multiple traditions simultaneously. This kind of genre blending, taking elements from R&B, hip-hop, soul, and pop, and combining them in new ways, became, during the 1990s and increasingly in the decades that followed, less the exception and more genuinely the norm for how popular music was being created. I think this genre blending tendency deserves real attention, because it represents something that, in some ways, brings us full circle back to where we started tonight. Remember our very first section, where we talked about how, even in the colonial era, multiple musical traditions, Native American ceremonial music, New England hymn singing, formal European concert music, Appalachian ballads, African rhythms and instruments, existed alongside each other, sometimes blending, sometimes remaining separate. For much of the time between then and the 1990s, American music developed largely through what we might call genre formation, distinct traditions crystallizing into recognizable genres with their own names, their own audiences, their own commercial categories: blues, jazz, country, rock and roll, soul, funk, hip-hop, and so on. But by the 1990s, and increasingly ever since, we start to see something that feels like it's moving in the opposite direction. genres that had spent decades establishing their own distinct identities beginning to blend back together, with individual artists and individual songs drawing freely on multiple traditions simultaneously, in ways that make the old genre categories increasingly difficult to apply cleanly. I don't think this represents some kind of loss compared to the earlier era of more distinct genres. I think it's simply what happens when multiple, genuinely rich musical traditions have had decades to develop, decades during which musicians grew up listening to all of these traditions simultaneously, absorbing influences from genres their own parents might have considered completely separate and unrelated. As we move toward the end of the 1990s and into the new millennium, which is where our journey is headed in our remaining sections tonight, I want you to hold onto this image of genre blending as something that's increasingly going to characterize how American music develops. We're moving from a story that's largely been about distinct traditions developing somewhat separately and then occasionally intersecting. The blues meeting gospel, country meeting blues, funk feeding into hip-hop. Toward a story where these intersections become so frequent, so normalized, that intersection stops being quite the right word because the traditions themselves have become so thoroughly interwoven that pulling them apart into separate threads becomes, in some genuine sense, less and less possible. And, perhaps, less and less meaningful as a way of understanding what's actually happening in the music itself. As we cross into the new millennium, I want to pause for a moment and think about something we haven't really discussed directly yet tonight, even though it's been quietly shaping everything we've talked about. The music industry itself, as a business, and how the actual mechanics of how music gets made, distributed, sold, and consumed have changed over the course of our 250-year journey. Because the early 2000s bring us to one of the most genuinely disruptive shifts in those mechanics that the industry has ever experienced. Think back to where we started tonight. Communal singing in New England meeting houses, with no concept of the music industry at all. Music existing purely as something people did together, with no commercial transaction involved. Then think about the gradual emergence of sheet music publishing, and later, the recording industry. The Bristol Sessions in 1927, Sun Records in Memphis, Motown's assembly line approach in Detroit. For most of the 20th century, the music industry operated on a model where making money from music meant selling physical objects. First sheet music, then records, then cassette tapes, then compact discs, and where access to the infrastructure needed to record, manufacture, and distribute these physical objects was controlled by a relatively small number of companies. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, digital technology began fundamentally challenging this model. Music could now be converted into digital files that could be copied, essentially without limit, at essentially no cost, and shared across the internet. A technological shift that created genuine chaos within the music industry for a period, as the traditional business model built around selling physical copies of recordings came under genuine threat from this new ability to share digital copies freely. I don't want to spend too much time on the business history here, because our focus tonight is really on the music itself and the people who made it. But I think this technological shift is genuinely important for understanding the musical developments of the 2000s and 2010s, because it changed, in some genuinely significant ways, both how music got made and how it reached audiences. On the how music got made side, digital recording technology became dramatically more affordable and accessible during this period. Where making a professional quality recording had previously required access to expensive studios and expensive equipment. Think about Sun Studio in Memphis, or Motown's Hitsville, USA building, places with specific physical infrastructure that artists needed access to. By the 2000s, and increasingly through the 2010s, it became possible to create recordings of genuinely professional quality using equipment that was, by historical standards, remarkably affordable, sometimes even using just a personal computer with the right software. This democratization of music production technology connects, I think, to something we've discussed multiple times tonight as a recurring theme. Musical innovation often comes from people who don't have access to the most expensive, most proper equipment, finding creative ways to make compelling music with whatever they do have access to. We saw this with DJ Kool Herc and his 2 turntables. We saw it with punk's DIY ethos. And in the 2000s and 2010s, this same basic dynamic played out again, but at a genuinely massive scale, as digital recording technology put tools that had once required professional studios into the hands of enormously larger numbers of people. On the how music reached audiences side, the shift from physical sales to digital distribution and eventually to streaming. where listeners don't purchase individual recordings at all, but instead pay for access to enormous libraries of music, with royalties distributed based on how much each recording gets listened to. Fundamentally changed the economics of how musicians make money from recorded music, and also changed, in genuinely significant ways, how listeners discover and engage with music. Let's bring this back to the actual musical developments of this period, because all of this technological and business context shapes, though doesn't fully determine, what kinds of music got made and how they sounded. Hip-hop, which we discussed at the end of our previous section as having become, by many measures, the dominant genre in American popular music by the end of the 1990s, continued its dominance and its evolution throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s. The genre continued the genre-blending tendency we discussed, incorporating elements from R&B, from electronic music, from rock, from pop, while also continuing to develop its own internal, regional, and stylistic diversity, with different cities and regions across the country developing their own distinctive approaches to production, lyrical style, and rhythmic feel. I want to mention something here about a specific technological development that had a genuinely significant impact on hip-hop and on popular music more broadly during this period. Software that allowed for increasingly sophisticated manipulation of vocal pitch. This technology, which had actually existed for a while before becoming widely noticed, achieved a kind of cultural breakthrough moment when an artist used it in a deliberately obvious, stylized way, rather than using the technology to subtly correct pitch, as it had often been used previously. This artist used it in a way that was clearly audible, almost as an instrument in its own right, creating a distinctive robotic or processed vocal quality. This deliberate, stylized use of pitch correction technology became enormously influential, and it represents, I think, another example of something we've seen repeatedly tonight. A piece of technology originally designed for one purpose. In this case, subtly fixing minor vocal imperfections, being repurposed by creative musicians in ways the original designers probably never anticipated, becoming, itself, a recognizable and influential sound. We saw this with the solid body electric guitar enabling rock and roll's volume and presence. We saw it with sampling technology, originally perhaps conceived for more modest purposes, becoming central to hip-hop's creative vocabulary. And here, we see it again with vocal pitch correction technology becoming, for some artists and some songs, a deliberate aesthetic choice rather than a corrective tool. Let's also talk about what was happening in country music during this period, because the 2000s and 2010s saw continued evolution of the patterns we discussed earlier. The ongoing negotiation between traditional country sounds and various forms of crossover with other genres. During this period, country music increasingly incorporated elements from rock and from hip-hop and R&B, production techniques, rhythmic approaches, and in some cases collaborations between country artists and artists from these other genres, creating hybrid sounds that, a few decades earlier, would have seemed genuinely surprising for a genre with country music's specific historical associations and audience. This connects back to something we discussed in our previous section about genre blending becoming increasingly normalized. By the 2000s and 2010s, the idea of a country artist incorporating hip-hop influenced production, or a pop artist incorporating elements from electronic dance music, or an R&B artist drawing on rock instrumentation, had become genuinely common, in ways that reflect just how thoroughly interwoven these traditions had become for musicians who'd grown up, as listeners, with access to all of these genres simultaneously through the kind of digital distribution and streaming technology we discussed earlier. Now, I want to take a moment here for one of the lighter observations I promised earlier tonight, because I think there's something genuinely funny about where we've ended up. We started this journey in a cold New England meeting house, with unaccompanied voices singing hymns using a notation system involving triangles and squares, because most people couldn't read standard musical notation. We're now in an era where a single artist, working largely alone with a laptop, software, and an internet connection, can create a recording that gets heard by literally hundreds of millions of people around the world, often within days of being made available. A level of reach that the most successful musicians of any previous era in our story tonight, including figures we've discussed, who achieved genuinely massive commercial success like Michael Jackson in the 1980s, simply didn't have access to, because the infrastructure for that kind of instantaneous global reach didn't exist yet. If you tried to explain this to someone in that New England meeting house, someday, a teenager in their bedroom will be able to make a recording that gets heard by more people, in more countries, in less time, than exists in the entire population of the colonies you currently live in. I genuinely don't think they'd have any framework for understanding what you were describing. It's not just that the technology would seem like magic to them, it's that the entire concept of audience at that scale would be almost incomprehensible. Let's also touch on something that I think deserves real attention as we move through this period. The increasing visibility and commercial success of musical styles and artists from outside the traditional genres we've been discussing tonight, reflecting America's own ongoing demographic and cultural changes. Music with roots in Latin American traditions, for instance, achieved genuinely significant mainstream commercial breakthroughs during this period, in ways that connect to America's large and growing Latino population, and to broader patterns of cultural exchange between the United States and Latin America that, frankly, deserve their own multi-hour exploration in their own right. Though tonight, given our focus, I want to at least acknowledge this as part of the broader picture of American music in the 21st century. A landscape that's increasingly reflective of America's full demographic diversity, with musical traditions that have deep roots in communities that, for much of the earlier history we've discussed tonight, existed somewhat outside the mainstream commercial categories we've been tracing. As we move toward our final sections tonight, I want to bring together everything we've discussed about this most recent period. Digital technology has fundamentally changed both how music gets made and how it reaches audiences, democratizing access to professional quality recording tools while also creating genuine economic disruption for the traditional music industry business model. Hip-hop has continued its dominance while becoming increasingly genre-blended. Country music has continued its decades-long negotiation between tradition and crossover, now incorporating influences from hip-hop and R&B. And the overall landscape of American popular music has become increasingly reflective of the country's full demographic diversity, with traditions that have deep roots in specific communities, achieving mainstream commercial success on a scale that, in many cases, simply hadn't been possible in earlier decades, when the infrastructure of radio formats, record store categories, and television programming tended to sort music into much narrower, more rigidly defined boxes than the streaming era landscape allows for. I think it's worth pausing here to notice something about the shape of this story so far. For roughly the first 200 years of our journey tonight, from the colonial era through, say, the late 1900s, American music developed largely through a process of genres forming, establishing themselves, and then often existing in relative separation from each other, at least in terms of how the industry packaged and sold them, even when the underlying musical influences were genuinely blended. Race records and hillbilly records, pop charts and R&B charts, album-oriented rock radio stations and country radio stations and urban contemporary radio stations, each with their own programming, their own audiences, their own internal star systems. But over the past roughly 25 years, that picture has changed dramatically. The walls between these categories, walls that were always, in some sense, more about marketing and industry structure than about the actual musical DNA involved, have become increasingly porous, increasingly easy for both artists and listeners to move across or simply ignore. A song can draw on country instrumentation, hip-hop rhythmic sensibilities, pop song structure, and R&B vocal production simultaneously. And rather than this being treated as some kind of genre violation requiring justification, it's often simply treated as a song. Just a song that sounds like itself, drawing on whatever influences the artist who made it happens to have absorbed. I think this is genuinely one of the most significant shifts in the entire story we've been telling tonight. Not because any individual genre has disappeared, but because the categories themselves have become less load-bearing, less central to how music actually gets experienced by most listeners. And I think this connects, in a genuinely meaningful way, back to where we started this evening. Remember those multiple, simultaneous musical traditions existing side by side in colonial America? Native American, ceremonial music, New England hymns, Appalachian ballads, African rhythms and instruments? In some ways, the streaming era landscape of American music represents a kind of return to that earlier condition. Multiple traditions, coexisting, available simultaneously to anyone who wants to listen, without the same kind of rigid sorting into separate commercial categories that characterized most of the 20th century. The difference, of course, is scale. What was once a handful of traditions existing within relatively small, geographically separated colonial communities has become dozens of interwoven traditions, available simultaneously to billions of people around the entire planet, instantly, at any hour of the day or night. Let's pause here for a moment and do something a little different. Let's take a step back from the chronological march through decades and instead think about some of the connective threads that run all the way through tonight's story, the patterns that show up again and again across 250 years, because I think seeing these patterns laid out together helps make sense of why American music has developed the way it has. The first pattern, and probably the most important one, is something we've touched on repeatedly: the foundational role of African American musical traditions in essentially every major genre we've discussed tonight. Let's just trace this lineage one more time, all the way through, because I think it's genuinely worth seeing it as a single continuous thread rather than as separate moments scattered across the evening. It starts with the rhythmic traditions and instruments. Drums, the banjo's African and Arabian roots, that enslaved Africans brought with them, traditions that were preserved against genuinely enormous odds, partly through spaces like Congo Square in New Orleans, where some of these traditions survived more intact than almost anywhere else in North America. From there, these traditions fed into spirituals, religious music born out of the Hush Harbor gatherings we discussed, where enslaved people combined African musical sensibilities with Christian worship, creating something genuinely new. Spirituals, work songs, and field hollers then fed directly into the blues, developing in the post-Civil War South among sharecroppers whose economic circumstances, as we discussed, remained genuinely difficult even after the formal end of slavery. The blues then fed into jazz, developing in New Orleans through brass bands, funeral processions, and the preserved rhythmic traditions of Congo Square, with Louis Armstrong helping push the music toward featured improvised solos. The blues also fed into early country music. Remember, the banjo itself carries this African lineage, and early country recordings, including those by Jimmy Rogers, incorporated blues structures directly, even as the commercial race records versus hillbilly records marketing categories tried to keep these traditions artificially separate. Gospel music, developing alongside the blues and sharing deep roots with it, gave us figures like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, whose electric guitar playing and performance style have been described as a genuine foundational influence on rock and roll. Meaning that when Elvis Presley walked into Sun's studio in 1954, the bluesy vocal style and the physical performance mannerisms he brought with him were themselves already deeply rooted in this same lineage of black gospel and blues performance, rhythm and blues and jump blues. Remember Louis Jordan and his guitarist Carl Hogan, whose guitar intro Chuck Berry would later copy note for note, fed directly into rock and roll's guitar vocabulary. Motown and Southern Soul, in the 1960s, represented this same lineage, achieving massive mainstream commercial success, with Aretha Franklin's gospel-rooted vocal power representing, for many, the absolute pinnacle of what this tradition could achieve. Funk pushed the rhythmic precision that had always been central to this lineage to new heights with James Brown's isolated breaks. And those exact breaks, those James Brown funk breaks, became the literal raw material that DJ Kool Herc used to create hip-hop in the Bronx in 1973, the genre that, by the end of the 1990s, had become the dominant force in American popular music, and that, in the 2000s and beyond, fed its influence into virtually every other genre, including country music. So when you trace it all the way through, drums and banjo, to spirituals, to blues, to jazz and gospel and early country, to rhythm and blues, to rock and roll, to soul and funk, to hip-hop, to the genre-blended landscape of today. You're tracing a single continuous lineage with branches and connections running in every direction, but with a common root system that goes all the way back to those African musical traditions that enslaved people preserved under conditions of genuine horror and managed against every possible obstacle to keep alive, develop, and pass forward. I think this is, without question, the single most important through line in the entire 250-year story we're telling tonight, and I wanted to make sure we traced it explicitly, start to finish, in one place. The second major pattern I want to highlight is something we've called in various forms throughout tonight, the famous origin point versus actual origin point pattern. We saw this with Bristol, Tennessee, and country music. Commercial country recordings actually began around 1922, but the 1927 Bristol sessions are remembered as the founding moment because that's where the genre's first true superstars emerged. We saw it with rock and roll. Rocket 88, recorded in 1951 by black musicians, is cited by many historians as the first rock and roll record, but Elvis Presley's 1954 recordings at that same studio became the moment most widely remembered and celebrated. And we saw it in a slightly different form with hip-hop. DJ Kool Herc's August 1973 party is the specific, dateable birth. But the broader development involved a community of innovators, including figures like Grandmaster Flash and Africa Bambaataa, working in roughly the same time and place. I think this pattern tells us something genuinely important about how history gets remembered versus how history actually happens. Actual musical innovation tends to be gradual, collaborative, and often happens in places and among people who, at the time, have no particular visibility or platform. Famous origin moments tend to be the points where this gradual, collaborative development first becomes visible to a wider audience, often through a specific recording, a specific commercial breakthrough, a specific person who happens to become a star. The famous moment isn't wrong, exactly. It's just often more like a window into a much longer, much more diffuse process, a process that was already well underway by the time anyone thought to point a microphone at it. The third pattern is the authenticity versus crossover tension, which we've seen play out in genuinely similar forms across multiple genres. Folk purists reacting to Dylan going electric in 1965. Debates about the Nashville sound's polish versus more traditional country approaches. Disco's massive commercial success generating genuine backlash. Grunge emerging partly as a reaction against the polish of 1980s pop and rock. Hip-hop's relationship with mainstream commercial success generating its own internal debates about what the music should sound like and who it should be for. I think what's genuinely interesting about this pattern is that it's not really about any specific musical style. It's about a recurring tension between a musical tradition's connection to a specific community, a specific history, a specific set of experiences, on one hand, and that same tradition's potential to reach much broader audiences, audiences who may not share that specific history, on the other hand. Every single genre we've discussed tonight has, at some point, faced some version of this tension. And every single time, the actual outcome has been some kind of ongoing negotiation rather than a clean resolution in either direction. The traditions don't simply stay pure and remain small, nor do they simply go mainstream and lose everything that made them distinctive. Instead, they tend to develop multiple simultaneous strands, some leaning more toward the original community and history, others leaning more toward broader crossover appeal, often coexisting, sometimes in genuine tension, but both remaining part of the broader genre's ongoing story. The fourth pattern, and this one connects to something I find genuinely moving when I think about it, is the role of technology, again and again, in enabling new musical developments in ways that the original creators of that technology often never anticipated. The solid-body electric guitar, designed to solve feedback problems, ended up enabling an entire genre's defining sonic characteristics. The transistor radio, simply a smaller and cheaper way to deliver the same broadcast content, ended up fundamentally reshaping the relationship between young people and music by giving them private, portable access to it. 2 turntables and 2 copies of the same record, equipment that disco DJs were already using for entirely different purposes, became, in DJ Kool Herc's hands, the foundational technology of an entirely new genre. Sampling technology, digital recording software, pitch correction tools. Over and over, we see musicians taking tools that were designed to do one specific thing and using them to do something genuinely different and genuinely new, something the tool's original designers simply hadn't imagined. I think there's something genuinely hopeful in this pattern, actually. It suggests that musical innovation isn't something that requires waiting for someone to specifically invent new music technology. It's something that can happen whenever creative people get access to any technology at all, because creative people will find ways to use that technology that nobody anticipated. The history of American music, in this sense, is partly a history of unintended consequences, of tools built for one purpose ending up reshaping culture in ways that have nothing to do with their original purpose. The fifth and final pattern I want to highlight tonight is geographic. The way specific places, often unglamorous, often economically struggling places, have repeatedly turned out to be where genuinely transformative musical developments happened. The Mississippi Delta, isolated and impoverished, gave us the blues. New Orleans, with its specific colonial history that allowed traditions like Congo Square to survive, gave us jazz. Bristol, a railroad town on the Tennessee-Virginia border, gave us country music's first superstars. Memphis, where Sam Phillips set up a small studio because he believed in music that the mainstream industry was ignoring, gave us the recordings that became central to rock and roll's mainstream breakthrough. Detroit, a city built around automobile assembly lines, gave us Motown's assembly line approach to making hit records. In the Bronx, facing genuine economic hardship in the early 1970s, gave us hip-hop. None of these places were, at the time, considered major centers of the music industry. The major industry centers, for most of this period, were places like New York and Los Angeles. But again and again, the genuinely new things, the things that ended up reshaping the entire landscape, came from somewhere else, from places and communities that existed somewhat outside the industry's main centers of gravity. I think this connects back to something we discussed earlier about technology and unintended consequences. Just as tools get repurposed in ways their designers didn't anticipate, places that aren't supposed to be centers of musical innovation keep turning out to be exactly that, again and again, throughout this entire 250-year story. So those are the 5 patterns I wanted to make sure we named explicitly. The foundational, continuous lineage of African American musical traditions running through nearly everything. The gap between famous origin points and actual origin points. The recurring authenticity versus crossover tension. Technology's role in enabling unintended musical innovations. And the recurring importance of unglamorous, economically struggling places as sources of genuinely transformative musical developments. As we move into our final sections tonight, I think you'll start noticing these patterns showing up again in new forms as we look at where American music stands today and think about what its next 250 years might look like. Let's turn our attention now to something we've mentioned only in passing tonight, but that deserves real focus. The role of women throughout this entire 250-year story. Because I think when you look back across everything we've discussed, there's a genuinely important pattern here too. One of extraordinary contribution, often combined with the kind of historical under-recognition that we've already discussed in other contexts tonight. Let's go back through some of the figures we've mentioned and think about them specifically through this lens. Maybelle Carter, whose Carter scratch guitar style became one of the most influential guitar techniques in all of American music. A technique that countless guitarists across multiple genres would go on to use and build upon. Sister Rosetta Tharpe, whose electric guitar playing and performance style have been described as a foundational influence on rock and roll itself, meaning that one of the central instrumental and performance vocabularies of an entire genre traces back, in significant part, to a woman whose name, I'd guess, is considerably less widely known than many of the male rock and roll pioneers who came after her and who built on what she'd already established. Aretha Franklin, whose vocal performances during the height of soul music's development have been described again and again by critics and by fellow musicians as among the greatest vocal performances in the entire history of recorded music. Performances that drew on her background in the church, on the gospel vocal traditions we discussed, transformed into secular music with a power that helped define what soul music could be. And as we moved into more recent decades, we talked about Madonna's role in establishing a template for pop stardom built around music, image, and reinvention. A template that, again, countless artists across multiple genres have built upon in the decades since. I want to be honest here about something. Tonight's journey, like most tellings of American music history, has probably still underrepresented the contributions of women relative to their actual historical importance. Not because women's contributions were less significant, but because the historical record itself, and the way that record has traditionally been compiled, has often focused more attention on male performers, male band leaders, male producers, and male executives, even when women were doing work that was, in terms of actual musical influence, every bit as significant. This is, I think, genuinely connected to broader patterns we've discussed tonight about credit and recognition. The same kinds of patterns we saw with Carl Hogan, the jump blues guitarist whose guitar intro Chuck Berry copied note for note, receiving considerably less recognition than Berry did for popularizing that same musical idea. Throughout American music history, there's been a recurring pattern where the people who develop foundational ideas, techniques, and sounds don't always receive the same level of recognition as the people who later popularize those same ideas to wider audiences. And this pattern has affected women, and African American women in particular, in ways that are genuinely significant when you look at the full picture. Let's also spend some time thinking about something else that's been present throughout tonight's story, but that I want to address more directly. The role of geography and migration, not just in terms of the specific places we've discussed. The Mississippi Delta, New Orleans, Bristol, Memphis, Detroit, the Bronx, but in terms of the broader pattern of movement that connects all of these places. We talked about the Great Migration, the movement of millions of African Americans from the rural South to cities in the North, Midwest, and West, beginning around the 1910s and continuing for decades. This migration is genuinely one of the most significant demographic movements in American history, and its musical consequences, as we discussed with Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, bringing Delta blues traditions to Chicago and transforming them through electrification, were genuinely profound. But there's another, smaller scale pattern of migration that's relevant here too. The movement of musicians, specifically, often toward whatever city happened to have the recording infrastructure, or the venues, or the audiences, that a particular kind of music needed in order to develop and find its audience. Jimmy Rogers traveling 100 miles to get to Bristol. Chuck Berry driving to Chicago specifically to find a record label. DJ Kool Herc's family moving from Kingston, Jamaica, to the Bronx, bringing Jamaican sound system traditions with them. I think this pattern of migration, both the large-scale historical migrations like the Great Migration and the smaller-scale movements of individual musicians seeking out the right place, the right audience, the right opportunity, is genuinely central to understanding why American music developed the way it did. Musical traditions, in this story, are rarely static. They're almost always traditions in motion, traditions that develop specifically because people carrying those traditions moved from one place to another, bringing their music with them, and finding that music changed, sometimes dramatically, through contact with new environments, new audiences, and new musical traditions they encountered along the way. Now let's think about something a bit different, the role of radio, specifically, as a technology that's run through this entire story, often in ways that don't get as much attention as records or, more recently, streaming. Radio's importance shows up again and again throughout tonight's journey. We mentioned how Mississippi's low rates of radio ownership in the early 1900s contributed to the Delta blues developing in relative isolation. We mentioned how a DJ playing Chuck Berry's Maybelline on a prominent New York radio program helped that song rise quickly on the charts. We mentioned radio disc jockeys in the mid-1950s, being the ones who started calling this new blend of rhythm and blues and country rock and roll, meaning that the very name of one of the most important genres in this entire story came from radio DJs, not from the musicians themselves or from record company executives. Radio, in other words, has functioned throughout this story as a genuinely crucial intermediary. The thing that connects music being made in one place to audiences in other places, the thing that can take a regional sound and either keep it regional by simply not playing it or transform it into something with national or even international reach by playing it widely. And radio's role in maintaining or breaking down. The racial segregation of American music has been genuinely significant throughout this story too, from the era of race records, being deliberately kept off radio stations that catered to white audiences, to the moment when white teenagers, with their own private transistor radios, started seeking out and listening to music that radio programmers hadn't necessarily intended for them to hear. I want to bring in one more quirky tidbit here, something that I think connects to this radio theme in a genuinely fun way. Remember that detail we mentioned about Mississippi having the lowest rates of radio ownership, automobile ownership, and telephone access during the key years of Delta blues development? There's something genuinely interesting about the idea that one of the most influential musical traditions in American history developed partly because of a lack of access to the very technology, radio, that would later become so important for spreading other genres nationally. It's almost like the blues developed in a kind of technological bubble, protected from outside influences by the absence of the same technology that, in other contexts throughout tonight's story, has been so important for spreading musical influences around. And then, once that bubble eventually did connect to the broader technological and commercial infrastructure. Once Delta blues musicians started migrating to cities, started getting access to radio, started getting recorded, the music that emerged from that previously isolated tradition ended up having an influence on everything that came after that's genuinely difficult to overstate. Historians still argue about how much weight to give to this kind of isolation as an explanatory factor. Some scholars push back against narratives that frame isolated, untouched rural communities as somehow more authentic sources of musical tradition, pointing out that this framing can sometimes romanticize poverty and isolation in ways that don't fully grapple with the genuine hardship involved, or that can understate the ways that even isolated communities were never actually completely cut off from outside influences. I think this is a genuinely important caution, and it connects to something we discussed earlier about the authenticity versus crossover tension. There's a real risk, when telling stories like the one we're telling tonight, of romanticizing isolation and hardship in ways that can obscure the genuine difficulty of the actual lived experiences involved, even while we're also trying to honestly acknowledge the genuine creative significance of what emerged from those experiences. I think the honest way to hold both of these things together is this. The hardship was real, and it mattered. Not because hardship is somehow good for creativity in some romantic sense, but because the specific historical and economic circumstances people were living through shaped, in genuinely traceable ways, the kind of music they made, the instruments they had access to, the audiences they could reach, and the stories they had to tell. Acknowledging this connection between circumstance and creativity doesn't mean celebrating the circumstances themselves. It means taking seriously the idea that the music we've been discussing tonight emerged from real people living through real, often genuinely difficult, historical conditions, and that the music itself often represents these people's own attempts to process, express, and sometimes transcend those conditions on their own terms, using whatever tools and traditions they had available. As we move toward our final sections tonight, I want to carry this thought forward. Behind every genre, every recording, every famous moment we've discussed tonight, there are real people. Often people who, like the participants in DJ Kool Herc's 1973 party, or the musicians who showed up in Bristol in 1927, had no idea they were making history, and who were simply trying to make music, make a living, express something true about their experience, or, in some cases, just have a good time on a Saturday night. The 250-year story we're telling tonight is, in the end, made up of an almost uncountable number of these individual human moments. Moments that, taken together, add up to something genuinely larger than any single person involved could have imagined. Let's take some time now to think about something genuinely fascinating, the international dimension of this story. Because while tonight's journey has been framed as American music history, I think by this point in our evening, it should be genuinely clear that this story has never actually been contained within America's borders. It's always been a story of music traveling outward, getting transformed by international influences, and traveling back again in an ongoing cycle that's been running for the entire 250 years we've been discussing. We've already talked about one major example of this, the British invasion of the 1960s, where British musicians who'd grown up obsessively listening to American blues, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll formed bands that achieved massive commercial success in America, in some cases introducing American audiences to American musical traditions that hadn't achieved the same mainstream success in their country of origin. But this pattern of international circulation runs through essentially the entire story we've told tonight, in ways that are genuinely worth pausing on. Think back to our very first section, where we talked about the musical traditions that European settlers brought with them to the American colonies. English, Scottish, Irish, German, French, Italian musical traditions, all arriving in America and beginning to transform through contact with American circumstances and with African musical traditions. This is, in a sense, the first wave of this international circulation, musical traditions traveling from Europe to America and beginning to change. The banjo's journey, from instruments with roots in Africa and ultimately connections to even older Arabian instrument traditions, to becoming one of the most quintessentially American instruments, central to country and bluegrass music, represents another version of this same pattern. An instrument tradition traveling across continents and oceans, arriving in America under genuinely horrific historical circumstances, and becoming, over time, something that most people today would describe as distinctly American, with relatively few people aware of its much longer, much more geographically dispersed history. DJ Kool Herc's journey from Kingston, Jamaica, to the Bronx represents yet another version of this pattern. Jamaican sound system culture and toasting traditions developed in Jamaica, arriving in New York City through one specific family's migration, and becoming, through Herc's innovations, foundational to hip-hop, a genre that would go on to become one of the most globally dominant musical forms on the planet, eventually circulating back outward to countries around the world, including, eventually, back to Jamaica itself and to countless other countries, where local artists would develop their own versions of hip-hop, often blending it with their own local musical traditions, creating new hybrid forms that then, in some cases, circulate back into American hip-hop's own ongoing development. I think this last example, hip-hop's global spread, and the way international hip-hop scenes have developed their own innovations that then influence American hip-hop, represents something genuinely important about where this pattern of international circulation stands today, in the streaming era we discussed a couple of sections ago. In earlier eras of this story, international circulation tended to happen on a delay, and tended to require some kind of significant infrastructure. Physical records being shipped across oceans, radio signals reaching across borders, musicians physically traveling between countries. By the 2000s and 2010s, with digital distribution and streaming, this circulation can happen essentially instantly. A musical development happening in one country can be heard immediately by listeners and by other musicians anywhere else in the world with internet access, and can influence music being made in completely different countries within days or weeks, rather than the years or decades that earlier waves of international musical circulation often required. Let's also touch on something we discussed briefly in an earlier section: the increasing visibility of musical traditions with roots in Latin America, achieving genuinely significant mainstream commercial success in America during the 2000s, 2010s, and into the 2020s. I think this represents another genuinely important example of this same pattern of international circulation. Musical traditions that have deep roots in countries throughout Latin America, traditions that have, in many cases, been developing and evolving for generations within their own contexts, achieving mainstream commercial success within the United States in ways that reflect both America's own demographic changes, the growth of Latino communities within the United States, and the same kind of digital era international circulation we just discussed, where musical developments happening in one country can reach audiences in other countries essentially instantly. I want to be honest that this is an area where I think tonight's journey, given our specific framing around American music history, hasn't been able to give full justice to traditions that, in many cases, deserve their own multi-hour deep dive in their own right. Traditions that have their own rich histories, their own foundational figures, their own genuinely important moments of innovation, many of which would deserve exactly the kind of careful, detailed treatment we've tried to give to the traditions we have covered tonight. I think this is worth acknowledging, honestly, both because I don't want to give the impression that tonight's journey represents some kind of complete picture of American music. No single journey, however long, possibly could. And because I think these traditions and their genuinely significant contributions to the broader landscape of music that Americans listen to and that the world listens to deserve genuine recognition, even within the constraints of what we've been able to cover tonight. Let's shift now to think about something else. The question of what happens to older genres and older traditions as new ones develop and, in some cases, come to dominate the commercial landscape. Because I think there's sometimes an assumption, and it's an assumption I want to push back against, that when a new genre becomes commercially dominant, the older genres it's displacing somehow disappear or become irrelevant or stop developing. This isn't what actually happens, based on everything we've discussed tonight. The blues, which we discussed as developing in the late 1800s and achieving its first major commercial recordings in the late 1920s, didn't disappear when jazz or rock and roll or any other genre achieved greater commercial dominance. Blues musicians continued performing, continued recording, continued developing the tradition, sometimes for audiences that were smaller than they'd once been, but genuinely committed audiences. Audiences for whom the blues represented something with real, ongoing meaning and value, not just historical curiosity. The same is true of jazz, which, as we discussed, moved from being mass popular dance music in the swing era to something more artistically ambitious but commercially narrower with bebop, but which has continued developing, continued attracting serious musicians and serious audiences for decades since, even as it stopped being, in any meaningful sense, popular music in the way it had been during the swing era. Gospel music, similarly, has continued as a genuinely vibrant tradition within Black churches and within broader gospel music communities, even as the broader popular music landscape moved through soul, funk, hip-hop, and beyond. Gospel didn't end when soul music achieved mainstream crossover success. It continued as its own tradition, even as some of its vocal techniques and some of its performers moved into and influenced these other, more commercially dominant genres. I think the right way to think about this is something like, American music doesn't really work as a story of genres replacing each other, where each new dominant genre causes the previous one to disappear. It works more like a story of genres accumulating. Each new development adds something to an ever-growing, ever more complex landscape, without necessarily causing what came before to vanish. The landscape gets richer, more crowded, more diverse, with more traditions coexisting simultaneously, even as the commercial spotlight moves from one tradition to another over time. This brings me to another quirky tidbit I want to share, because I think it's a genuinely lovely example of this accumulation rather than replacement pattern. Those shape note singing traditions we discussed back in our very first section tonight, the New England hymn tradition, using triangles and squares and circles to help untrained singers learn harmony parts, That tradition is still genuinely alive today. There are communities, particularly in parts of the American South, where people still gather, sometimes for entire days, to sing through these centuries-old hymns together, using the same shape note notation system, in the same call and response, all-day format that their ancestors used. This is a tradition that's been continuously practiced for roughly 2.5 centuries, essentially the entire span of time we've been discussing tonight, existing the entire time, alongside everything else we've talked about, the blues, jazz, country, rock and roll, hip-hop, and everything in between. I find this genuinely moving, actually. The idea that somewhere in America, right now, while hip-hop and pop and country and every other genre we've discussed tonight continue developing and reaching audiences of hundreds of millions of people through streaming platforms, there are also people gathering in small halls and churches, singing 250-year-old hymns using a notation system, designed for people who couldn't read standard musical notation, keeping a tradition alive that connects directly back to the very beginning of tonight's journey. Both of these things are part of American music right now, simultaneously. The hyper-modern, globally streamed, technologically sophisticated landscape we discussed a couple of sections ago, and this much older, much smaller, but genuinely continuously practiced tradition that's been running in parallel with everything else this entire time. As we move toward our final 2 sections tonight, I want to hold on to this image of accumulation, of American music as something that keeps adding new layers, new traditions, new genres, without the older layers simply disappearing, creating, over 250 years, an almost unimaginably rich and complex landscape, with traditions stretching from those New England meeting houses all the way to whatever's being streamed, right now, by someone, somewhere, on a phone, in a language and a style that might draw on influences from literally anywhere on the planet. As we move into our second to last section tonight, I want to spend some time thinking about where things stand right now, in 2026, and what this moment might look like to someone studying it the way we've been studying earlier moments throughout tonight's journey. Because I think there's something genuinely interesting about trying to apply the same kind of historical perspective we've used for the Bristol sessions or DJ Kool Herc's 1973 party to the present moment, even though, by definition, we can't yet know which parts of right now will turn out to be the kinds of hinge points we've discussed throughout tonight. Let's start with something we touched on earlier: artificial intelligence and music. This is a genuinely new development, one that doesn't have a clean historical parallel within the story we've told tonight, though I think some of the patterns we've discussed do offer at least some useful ways of thinking about it. Tools that can generate music, or that can assist musicians in various ways using artificial intelligence, have begun appearing during this period, and they've generated genuinely significant debate. Debate about creativity, about authorship, about what happens to human musicians if these tools become widespread. I want to be careful here, because this is an area where it's genuinely difficult to know, right now, how things will develop. We're far too close to it to have the kind of historical perspective we've been able to bring to events from decades or centuries ago. But I think it's worth noting that every single major technological shift we've discussed tonight, the solid body electric guitar, the transistor radio, sampling technology, digital recording, pitch correction software, generated some degree of debate when it was new about its impact on real musicianship, on creativity, on what counted as authentic music making. Some of these debates, looking back, seem to have been resolved in the sense that the technology became simply part of the normal toolkit, without most people thinking of it as controversial anymore. Others, like ongoing debates about sampling and credit that we mentioned, remain genuinely unresolved even decades later. Historians still argue, and I genuinely mean this is an active, ongoing argument happening right now, not just a historical one, about how to think about AI's role in music. And I think it's honest to say that nobody, including people who study this professionally, really knows yet how this is going to play out. What I can say, based on everything we've discussed tonight, is that the pattern of new technology generates anxiety, gets used by creative people in ways nobody anticipated, and eventually becomes either normalized or remains a genuine point of ongoing tension has played out, in various forms, for literally the entire span of American music history we've covered tonight. So there's at least some reason to think that whatever happens with AI in music will follow some version of this same basic pattern, even if the specific details turn out to be genuinely unprecedented in other ways. Let's also think about something else that's genuinely characteristic of this current moment: the relationship between live performance and recorded music. For most of the story we've told tonight, live performance and recorded music existed in a relatively stable relationship. Recordings were, in some sense, documentation or distribution of music that also existed as live performance, and live performance remained genuinely central to how musicians built careers and connected with audiences. In the streaming era, this relationship has shifted in some genuinely interesting ways. With recorded music generating relatively modest revenue per listen compared to earlier eras of physical sales, live performance, touring, concerts, has become, for many musicians, an even more central part of how they actually make a living, even as recorded music remains the primary way most listeners actually discover and engage with an artist's work. This creates a genuinely interesting dynamic. The recordings function almost like advertising for the live experience, in some ways inverting the relationship that existed for much of the 20th century, where live performance often functioned more like promotion for record sales. I think this is worth mentioning because it connects to something we discussed much earlier tonight. Remember those New England meeting houses where music existed purely as a live, communal experience with no recording technology at all? In some genuinely interesting ways, the increasing importance of live performance in the streaming era represents a kind of partial return to music's much older identity as something that happens between people, in real time, in a shared physical space. Even as the technology surrounding that live experience and the way audiences discover and follow artists between live experiences remains thoroughly, unmistakably modern. Now, let's think about something else. The increasing visibility, in recent years, of artists and movements that explicitly engage with the kind of history we've been discussing tonight. Artists who incorporate elements from older traditions, sometimes quite deliberately and explicitly, into contemporary music, creating a kind of conscious dialogue with musical history rather than simply absorbing influences unconsciously through the general cultural atmosphere. We've talked about genre blending as something that's become increasingly normalized in recent decades. But I think there's a related, slightly different phenomenon worth noting too. A kind of historical consciousness, where artists and audiences alike have become increasingly aware of and increasingly interested in the actual history of the traditions they're drawing on. Documentaries, museums. Remember the Birthplace of Country Music Museum in Bristol, or the Motown Museum at the old Hitsville, USA building in Detroit. Books, and yes, I suppose, videos like the one you're listening to right now, all represent a kind of increasing public interest in understanding where this music actually came from, in ways that go beyond just enjoying the music itself. I think this increasing historical consciousness is genuinely interesting, because it suggests something about how musical traditions mature over time. In the earliest days of any genre we've discussed tonight, there generally wasn't much history to be conscious of yet. The music was new, it was about now, about the present moment and its concerns. But as genres accumulate decades, and now in some cases well over a century, of history, that history itself becomes something that later musicians and later audiences can engage with, reference, draw on, creating a kind of layered relationship with the past that simply wasn't possible for the earliest practitioners of any of these traditions, because for them, there wasn't yet enough the past to draw on. Let's bring in one more observation here, something I think is genuinely worth sitting with as we approach our final section tonight. Throughout this entire 250-year story, we've seen genuinely significant innovations come from people who were, by the standards of their own time, outsiders in some sense. Economically marginalized communities, regions outside the major industry centers, immigrants bringing traditions from elsewhere, young people without access to expensive equipment or formal training. And we've seen these innovations, again and again, eventually become absorbed into the mainstream, sometimes with appropriate credit and reward flowing back to their originators, and sometimes, genuinely often, if we're being honest about this history, without that credit and reward flowing back in proportion to the actual significance of the contribution. I think one of the genuinely important questions for the next chapter of this story, whatever that chapter turns out to look like, is whether this pattern continues or whether some of the structural changes we've discussed tonight, particularly around digital distribution and the ways it's changed who has access to making and distributing professional quality recordings, might shift this pattern in some way. Could the increased accessibility of music-making tools mean that genuinely innovative new musical developments, wherever they emerge from, are more likely to be directly connected, from the start, to the people who actually created them, rather than requiring the kind of multi-step journey? Through record labels, through cover versions, through the recording industry's traditional gatekeeping structures, that so much of the music we've discussed tonight had to go through before reaching wide audiences? I genuinely don't know the answer to this question, and I think honesty requires acknowledging that. But I think it's a genuinely important question to be asking, given everything we've traced tonight about how credit, recognition, and financial reward have historically flowed, often quite unevenly, through the story of American music's development. As we move into our final section tonight, I want to bring together everything we've discussed across this entire journey. From those cold New England meeting houses, through the Mississippi Delta and New Orleans, through Bristol and Memphis and Detroit and the Bronx, through the British invasion and the streaming era, all the way to this current moment, with its AI tools and its genre-blended landscape, and its renewed interest in historical consciousness. 250 years is a genuinely long time. And yet, as we've seen again and again tonight, the threads connecting the beginning of this story to its present moment are genuinely continuous, genuinely traceable, even as the specific sounds, technologies, and circumstances have changed almost beyond recognition. We've traveled an enormous distance tonight, 250 years, from one end of this story to the other. And as we come to a close, I want to walk back through this journey one more time, slowly, the way you might look back through old photographs after a long trip, letting each image settle for a moment before moving to the next. We began in a cold New England meeting house, with voices rising together in hymns, using a shape note notation system of triangles and squares and circles that let untrained singers learn harmony. A tradition that, remarkably, is still practiced today, in halls and churches where people gather to sing these same songs using this same system, a living thread connecting our very first moment tonight to right now. We talked about the formal European concert societies that opened in cities like Charleston in 1776, bringing imported classical traditions to colonial audiences, a completely different musical world existing simultaneously with those New England hymns. We talked about settlers moving into the Appalachian Mountains, carrying ballads like Barbara Allen and Mattie Groves from the British Isles, and about how these ballads slowly changed, their subject matter shifting from Old World themes to American ones, while fiddle traditions developed in ways that historians still describe as cultural cousins across English, Scottish, Irish, and American styles, rather than tracing back to any single source. And we talked about enslaved Africans, brought to American shores against their will, carrying with them, in the truest sense, because it couldn't be taken from them. Musical traditions involving rhythm, instruments like the banjo with its deep roots in Africa and ultimately Arabia, and ways of singing and storytelling that would become the foundation for nearly everything that followed. We watched these traditions develop into spirituals, born from secret hush harbor gatherings, and we watched spirituals, work songs, and field hollers feed into the blues, developing among sharecroppers in the Mississippi Delta in the decades after the Civil War. A tradition that existed almost entirely outside the recording industry for decades, developing in relative isolation partly because of how cut off these communities were from broader technological networks like radio. We traveled to New Orleans, where Congo Square had preserved African musical traditions more intact than almost anywhere else in the country, and where these traditions, combined with brass band funeral traditions and the city's uniquely blended cultural heritage, gave birth to jazz, with Louis Armstrong helping shift the music from collective improvisation toward featured solos, becoming, by 1949, the first jazz musician ever to appear on the cover of Time magazine. We traveled to Bristol, Tennessee, in the summer of 1927, where Ralph Peer's recording sessions gave us the Carter family, with Maybelle Carter, 8 months pregnant, developing the guitar style that would influence generations, and Jimmy Rogers, whose blue yodel made him the father of country music, even though commercial country recordings had actually begun a few years earlier in 1922. A reminder that famous origin points and actual origin points are often different things. We watched the Great Migration carry Delta blues to Chicago, where Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf electrified the sound, and where a song called Rollin' Stone rippled outward to influence a British band's name, a Bob Dylan song, in a music magazine. We traveled to Memphis, where Sam Phillips opened Sun Studio in January of 1950, believing in music the mainstream industry was ignoring, and where Rocket 88, recorded in 1951, represents, for many historians, rock and roll's actual birth, 3 years before Elvis Presley's 1954 recordings became the moment most widely remembered. We talked honestly about Elvis, about Chuck Berry's own framing, crediting the young white teenage audience rather than any single performer for popularizing this music, and about how the solid body electric guitar and the transistor radio were technologies that, almost by accident, gave rock and roll both its sound and its audience. We traveled to Detroit, where Barry Gordy, working an $800 loan from his family and his own experience on an automobile assembly line, built Motown into one of the most successful black-owned businesses in American history, with the Funk Brothers providing the musical foundation for the Supremes, the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, and eventually the Jackson 5. We watched folk music's revival collide with rock when Bob Dylan went electric in 1965, and we watched the British invasion send American blues and rock and roll across the Atlantic and back again, with the Beatles covering Motown's Money and the Rolling Stones taking their name from that same Muddy Waters song. We talked about Aretha Franklin's gospel-rooted vocal power defining soul music's peak, and about James Brown's funk breaks, those isolated moments of pure rhythm, becoming the raw material for something genuinely new. And we traveled to the Bronx, to a recreation room at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue on August 11th, 1973, where DJ Kool Herc, using 2 turntables and 2 copies of the same record, extended those funk breaks into something that dancers could move to for minutes instead of seconds, creating, at what was essentially a back-to-school party organized by his younger sister, the foundational technique of hip-hop, a genre that would go on to become, by the end of the 1990s, the dominant force in American popular music. We watched disco rise and face genuine backlash, watched punk reject the polish of progressive rock, watched MTV transform Michael Jackson and Madonna into truly global figures, watched grunge emerge from Seattle as yet another swing of that authenticity pendulum, and watched country music's decades-long negotiation between tradition and crossover continue through the 1990s and beyond. We talked about sampling, about pitch correction technology used as a deliberate aesthetic choice, about digital recording, democratizing access to professional quality production, and about streaming fundamentally reshaping both how music gets made and how it reaches audiences. We named the patterns that run through all of this. The continuous lineage of African American musical traditions running through nearly everything we discussed. The recurring gap between famous origin points and actual origin points. The ongoing tension between authenticity and crossover appeal. Technology's role in enabling innovations nobody anticipated, and the recurring importance of unglamorous places. The Delta, New Orleans, Bristol, Memphis, Detroit, the Bronx, as sources of genuinely transformative musical developments. And here's a cheeky thought to close on. The kind of reality check I promised you at the start of tonight's journey. If you tried to play, in order, just one representative song from each major development we've discussed tonight, from unaccompanied shape note hymns, through Delta blues, through early jazz, through Bristol-era country, through Chicago blues, through Rocket 88 Inches and early Elvis, through Motown, through psychedelic and progressive rock, through disco, through early hip-hop, through 1980s pop, through grunge, through 1990s and 2000s hip-hop, all the way to whatever's topping the charts right now. You'd be listening to roughly 250 years of musical development in maybe 40 or 50 minutes. And I genuinely don't think your ears, or your brain, would know what to do with that kind of whiplash. The sonic distance between a New England hymn and a contemporary streaming hit is so enormous that hearing them back to back, with nothing in between, might be one of the more disorienting listening experiences you could possibly construct. You probably wouldn't survive it with your sense of musical continuity intact. And yet, as we've spent this entire journey demonstrating, that continuity is genuinely there, every step of the way, even if it's not something your ears could easily process all at once. So, what does 250 years of American music actually add up to? I think it adds up to this. An extraordinary, ongoing conversation between traditions that arrived from every direction. Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and traditions that were here long before any of those ships arrived. A conversation that's never actually stopped, that's only gotten richer and more complex with each passing decade, carried forward by people who, again and again, had no idea they were making history, who were just trying to express something true, make a living, or have a good time on a Saturday night. And somehow, out of all of that, out of cotton fields and recording studios, out of church basements and back-to-school parties, out of 2 turntables and an $800 loan, came a body of music that the entire world now listens to, dances to, and finds itself in. If tonight's journey has been good company, please subscribe to Sleepy ASMR Seduction and leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find their way to stories like this one. And let me know in the comments where you are in the world tonight and what time it is where you are. I love knowing how far these stories travel and to how many different places, while everyone listening drifts off in their own corner of the world. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight.